Welcome to the Greater Cambridge Citizens Assembly. Fantastic to see you all here this morning, and thank you very much for giving up your precious weekends to be part of this Citizen Assembly. Now, I tend to always ask people whether their transport was okay on the way to these events, which seems like particularly appropriate today, considering the topic of our assembly on road congestion, air quality, and improving public transport. So my name's Tim Hughes. I am going to be one of your lead facilitators for the weekend. And so it's my job, along with Suzannah at the front here, to help to kind of guide the proceedings of the Assembly and make sure that we stick to time and all of those sorts of things. So I'll tell you a little bit more about kind of how that's going to work in a little bit. But first of all, what is this thing that you've given up your precious weekend to be a part of? What is a Citizen Assembly? So a Citizen Assembly brings together a group of the public who are demographically representative of the public. So you kind of reflects the Greater Cambridge area, and also the kind of the transport to work area in terms of your kind of age, in terms of your gender, in terms of your ethnicity, social group as well. And so we make sure that we get a kind of a good cross-section of people to be part of the Citizen Assembly. As part of the Assembly, you're then going to hear evidence from lots of witnesses who are going to come in and talk to you around the issues that the Assembly is addressing. You're going to have the opportunity to deliberate with one another, kind of think about kind of what's most important from what you've heard, think about what are the key options in front of you. And then importantly, you're going to have the opportunity to come up with recommendations for GCP, in this case, on what you think should be done to tackle the issue that the Assembly is addressing. So this is the first Citizen Assembly to take place in Greater Cambridge. So in a sense, you're pioneering this in the local area. So you should be proud of that, and it's kind of a fantastic opportunity to get a really good kind of cross-section of the population together to delve into the detail of what is a really important topic, I'm sure you'll agree, for the local area. So in terms of kind of why this specific Citizen Assembly is happening, so it's been called by the Greater Cambridge Partnership. You'll hear a little bit from them later about why they decided to set up a Citizen Assembly and how it's going to help them with their decision making. This Citizen Assembly is also part of a national government programme called the Innovation and Democracy Programme, where we're essentially kind of piloting these sorts of methods for involving local population in kind of important issues for their area in 3 different places. So you're also part of that kind of wider government programme as well that this will help to support. So you've seen the Assembly question, and we'll go into this in a bit more detail in a bit. But importantly, GCP, you're not just being called together just to talk about anything. There's a very clear question that you're being asked to help to address, and that is, how do we reduce congestion, improve air quality, and provide better public transport in Greater Cambridge? So we'll go into a little bit more detail around that in a little bit. But a Citizen Assembly is a really fantastic way of dealing with these sorts of topics in depth. So you'll be here over kind of 4 days, so there'll be lots of opportunity for you to hear that expert evidence, lots of opportunity for you to have those conversations with your fellow Assembly members and really get into the detail of some of the kind of complexity and some of the trade-offs that might need to be made to address this issue. So I've already spoken a little bit about kind of GCP's role in commissioning and kind of calling for the Citizen Assembly. There are kind of 2 other organisations that I'll speak about that are part of kind of running the Assembly. So the Sortition Foundation were the first organisation that you would have heard from. They were the people who did the recruitment for the Citizen Assembly. So they were the people who sent out all of the invitations and then made sure that the group that we've kind of formed here today matches the demographics of the Greater Cambridge area. And the second organisation involved is the organisation that I'm the director of, and it's our job to essentially to design and to facilitate the assembly process. So it's our job to essentially kind of run the 2 weekends. So what will happen to the recommendations that you come up with? And we'll hear, as I said a little bit earlier, from GCP in a little bit about exactly kind of why they've called the assembly and how it's going to help them. But kind of 3 very quick points on this. So first of all, they will be written up into a report by us as kind of the independent facilitators of the process. So we'll make sure that we kind of capture all of the kind of the key information as we go through the assembly and make sure there's a publicly accessible report of what you've come up with, of your recommendations. So there will be, particularly in weekend 2, a little bit in weekend 1, there will be some kind of votes and some places where you're kind of signaling your priorities. And so we'll be capturing all of that information. But also, as we go through the different sessions, there'll be lots of kind of content that you're creating on your tables that we'll also take away, and we'll make sure that all gets written up and produced into that report as well. So then that report will be presented to the Greater Cambridge Partnership, and it will inform their work. And as I said, we'll hear a little bit later exactly kind of how they're intending to do that. And that final step that's on the screen at the moment is really important as well. So the Greater Cambridge Partnership will then feed back to you and also to the wider public around kind of how they're responding to your recommendations, to make sure that there's that kind of feedback about exactly what they're planning to do with what you come up with. So a few key people to mention in the room, and I've already mentioned kind of the role of myself and Suzannah as the lead facilitators. So essentially, we're here to make sure that the whole weekend runs as smoothly as possible, making sure that we kind of stick to time around the activities, kind of giving you some instructions from the front. You also have your table facilitators, so they're the people in the very glamorous kind of red t-shirts on your table. So we have, and I'm just going to go through my list to make sure I get them in the right order. So we have Lizzie here, we have Steve on this table, we have Kevin on the back table there, we have Mel here, Clive, Steph, Diane, and Penny at the back. So it's the job of the table facilitators to, a lot of the work that you'll be doing will be in the small groups on your table. It's their job to kind of lead you through those sessions, make sure that everybody gets the opportunity to have their say, and make sure that you kind of can complete the tasks that you're being set. So they're really there to support you with that. And then you will have noticed as you came in, lots of people in the green t-shirts. So they're the support team. They're here to help with lots of different aspects of kind of running the assembly. They were here to welcome you. They'll be here to kind of answer any questions and things as we go. If you have any issues with kind of I guess where anything is with lunch and things like that, then they're there to support you as well. And we'll also introduce you a little bit later to our 2 expert leads as well, who will be present throughout the whole assembly. And they're Peter and David. And it's their role to help to give you some of that evidence, give you some of that support, and also be on hand for questions that come up during the assembly. You will also notice at the back of the room we have people kind of sat kind of observing the process. And they're kind of a mixture of people from, we may have some kind of people from local media during the 2 weekends, from civil society groups, academics who are interested in the process. Also, the process being evaluated as well to make sure that we're doing a good job. And so the evaluator might be sat back there, but they're going to stay at the back. They're being asked not to talk to you during the assembly at any point, and we're kind of and importantly, they're not going to be kind of looking over your shoulder as you work on your tables, but they will be able to kind of see what happens in the room throughout the 2 weekends. So the final thing for me to say before we start to kind of have some introductions on the tables is around a few forms. So you will have been given some forms on the way in. You had an evaluation form, which I think most people have already filled out. If you've not, can you do that and hand it back to your table facilitator in the next session? There are also some consent forms as well for some photography and filming as well. And if you have any kind of questions around what's in those consent forms, then please don't hesitate to ask any of us and we can clarify that. But hopefully you've had a chance to already look at those and fill those in as well. I think most people have already dealt with their travel expenses, but if you've not, then have a word with Andreas, who isn't actually in the room at the moment, but he's in one of the green t-shirts and we'll have a badge with Andreas on, and we'll be able to deal with any of those queries as well to make sure that you get reimbursed for your travel. And I guess the final thing just to mention quickly around kind of social media, and we'll kind of go over this a little bit later as well, that we will encourage you to talk as much as you like really about being part of this process, and talk to your neighbours, talk to your friends, talk to anybody who will listen really about kind of your experience of being part of the Citizen Assembly. There are a few things that we'd ask you not to do at this point, and so one of those is not to report any of the conclusions of the Assembly, because we want to publish those all in one go so people can see the full kind of array of conclusions at once. So please kind of talk about your experience, but not kind of the content. And also, please don't kind of identify other people who are part of the Assembly. So everybody is kind of being offered kind of confidentiality, and so unless you have their permission, please don't take photos of people and don't kind of report who says what. But we'll go over that in a little bit more detail in a bit. So that's enough of me talking for now, and a quick opportunity for you on your tables to get acquainted with everybody around your table, and so I'll hand over to your table facilitators to lead that.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Obviously, there's quite a lot to say. I can hear. So listen, I just want to really quickly run through the aims and the agenda and some basic housekeeping, and then we'll be diving in. So sorry, it's a bit long at the beginning. We have to get through the admin. So the aims of today, Saturday, are to hear and explore how congestion, air quality and public transport impacts on our lives. So we're going to hear a number of speakers talking about impacts and hear from you about the impact that it has on your lives. You also have opportunities to have your questions answered. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, and speakers may not be able to, but we'll record those that don't get answered, and start to think about the impacts which are most important to address in the future as we move forward. And also, it's about getting to know your fellow participants. You're going to spend the next 4 days with them, and find out more about their views as well. And hopefully, you're going to have a good time. Yeah? It's your weekend. It's Saturday. Let's hope we can do that as well. So in terms of that, very briefly, you know you've got an outline agenda in your packs. So we've done some introductions. We're going to hear in a minute from Aidan and Rachel. Then we're going to hear a bit about the Greater Cambridge context. What is the situation? We'll hear from you about your reflections, and we'll have an opportunity to question those speakers. Then we get to have some lunch. And then after lunch, we're going to be focusing and hearing from a number of speakers talking about the impacts of congestion, air quality and public transport on different aspects of our lives. And then after we've had some Q&A with them, we will be going back to you at tables for you to really reflect on that and think about your own experiences on impacts and feedback on what for you are the key priorities. So that's going to be most of what we do today. And then tomorrow we're going to be looking at our kind of, well, what's the vision for the future? But today we're mainly looking at the impact of this on our lives. So just to be clear, it's quite a big question, and there's lots of things that the councils involved with GCP and GCP deal with. So things that we're not focusing on specifically is details of roads and routes, okay? Climate change it will come up. It will come up in our conversations, and it's contextual. And obviously, aspects like congestion have a big impact on climate change. But this isn't a climate change citizens' assembly. Okay? Whether or not growth happens. So we will be talking about growth, and we'll be hearing from Stephen in a bit. But that's in the context of what's already in local plans. So we're not reopening up local plans and growth and figures that are in there. Again, it might colour some of the conversations that you have and the views that you have. And we're not talking about other functions of the council. So we're not talking about, you know, bin collection or council tax rates or things like that. So we have quite a big task in the question that we have. So while some of these aspects might come up, we want to keep you centrally focused on recommendations on congestion, air quality, and public transport. So a couple of things to note. You will have, your facilitators, table facilitators, will have some evidence packs that in their folders. So before this assembly started, we asked, through Consult Cams and through in contact with other stakeholders, we said, what's the sort of evidence that the Citizens' Assembly should hear about? So in putting together the programme, we've drawn on those, that information that was suggested, and where people have suggested speakers, we've tried to get those in as well. So that might be something that you want to refer to. We also asked people to think about their travel stories, and outside of this room, actually on the flip side of where the table plans were, are some of the travel stories that people submitted about their experiences. So beyond this room, what are some other people's experiences of getting in and around Cambridge? And then we have the bike rack, which is over here on the right. So there may be things that, and your table facilitators might point this out to you, that is really, really burning and an issue for you, but it's not being something that is dealt with on your table. Take a post-it note, write with a Sharpie what your point, your comment is, and put it on the bike rack. And we will look at that, and we will look at that in terms of whether it's central to the question and we can build it into the second weekend, or whether that's just a place where you can sort of put other important items. So your bike rack is up there as well, and we'll reference that at a couple of points. So before we go to Aidan, just a couple of housekeeping things. Hopefully you've noticed where the toilets are. So as you came into the building on the right-hand side, there are some toilets. And then there are some sort of behind this wall as well. We are not due for a fire alarm. If there is one, if we hear something that sounds like a fire alarm, we come out of the building and we assemble in the middle of the car park. And I think that's it in terms of, so we've got breaks, so we've got lunch and we've got an afternoon break, but clearly if you need to get up and go to the loo at any point, then that's absolutely fine, okay? You might want to wait until we're doing a table session, but you know, we're not going to pin you down. So I think that's all I need to cover. So now I want to hand over to Aidan to say a few words.
Thank you very much. So my name is Aidan van der Weyer. I'm one of the people who will be actually making decisions on this and some of the related issues over the coming months. I'm also, as well as being on the Greater Cambridge Partnership, a councillor for a few small villages in South Cambridgeshire who, and I and many of the people I represent, will be really affected by what we decide. So politicians like to think they know what the public thinks. I mean, we do have to use that knowledge to base the decisions we make, but more often than not, who we get to hear from are really the most opinionated, the most vocal people. And the only time we really get to test our opinion is at election time, to find out whether we've actually got it right. And even then, so many other factors can come into play. Nevertheless, the decisions that we make have an impact on everyone, and moreover, these decisions should be being made for the people that we represent. Often there are conflicting views and opinions, and often these conflicting views and opinions are based on real differences in interests, and that can't easily be reconciled. Nevertheless, it is vital that we find the best ways of navigating through these differences and trying to reach consensus where possible. I think that in that process, it's probably worth trying to identify some of the things that we can agree on, some sort of values and opinions. I think we all want a prosperous place that we can all have a share of. We all want to live in strong and close communities. We want to make sure that we and the councils and governments look out for the least well-off and the most vulnerable. We need to care for our environment, both the nature immediately around us and the whole planet. And we think that the processes should be open and democratic. The fact that you're all here suggests that we all share a sense of civic duty as well. So the Citizens' Assembly, as you've heard, is a new part of the process for finding out, working out how to make decisions in the best way. They have been used before for some big national and ethical issues. This one we're asking to help us with some really practical local issues, but that doesn't mean they're any less important to our lives. Everyone cares about where they live, how they get to work, how they move around to see friends and family, how much time they spend sitting in traffic jams, how poor air quality might be harming our children's health, what environmental legacy we leave for our grandchildren. So I'm sure you will all have existing personal opinions about these things. With the part of the process is bringing that together, giving you facts and opinions from a range of experts, and giving you the time and space to really think about these things with peers who bring their own life experiences. And so going through this process, we think will help bring us a meaningful consensus and help us make progress on resolving these difficult issues. And hopefully it'll be quite fun as well through that process. I personally won't be here for most of this weekend. Obviously not because I'm not interested, but it really isn't the place for the politicians and the people who will ultimately be making the decisions to be giving our opinions, and as I said, giving you the space to deliberate, question, challenge, and then come to those recommendations as independently as possible, because this is genuinely an independent process. It is not being run by us, GCP, or the councils, but by Involve entirely separately. So we've had some interaction with the questions, but we're just letting you and Involve get on with it. I'm sure, as I said, many of you have strong opinions, which we'll be bringing to this here. Some of you might not have given this much thought. I think the main thing is that we come at this with an open mind, a willingness to listen to others' perspectives, and others' experiences, and to work together to reach the best recommendations we can. We, both you in this process and we as the councils, are not going to find a magic solution which solves it all. There is difficult choices, there are trade-offs that we need to make. In return for your time and your effort now, the GCP, the officers and the politicians making the decisions, we promise to listen seriously to what you're going to say. There are a lot of technical and financial issues that we need to take into account as well. So we can't promise that we will do absolutely everything you say, but we absolutely promise that we will consider your recommendations with sincerity and with respect and openly at our meetings. But to finish off, I do hope you enjoy this weekend, and I thank you so much for giving up your time. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Aidan. And now we're going to hear from Rachel, if I give her the slide clicker.
Thanks very much. So my name's Rachel Stopard. I'm the Chief Executive of the Greater Cambridge Partnership, and I'm really conscious you've been hearing about this thing, GCP, in quite a bit of the introduction. So I get officially the most boring slot of the day, that's what my colleagues have told me, to try to explain to you what is GCP and just to give you a bit of a context before you get going on the more interesting stuff, which is really about the content of the topic that underpins the question. So Greater Cambridge, when we talk about that, what's the geography that we're talking about? So it's Cambridge as a city, and then the wider area, which is the South Cambridgeshire District Council responsibilities. So that's the villages that really surround Cambridge. You'll also hear a lot over the next couple of days about the travel to work area, and you all represent Cambridge, South Cambridgeshire, and that wider travel to work area. Because for the topic that we're talking about, it's really important that we hear about your experiences across that wider patch. So the Greater Cambridge Partnership was set up to deliver a city deal. So government did a series of sort of deals with different places around the country a few years ago, and it was part of devolving some of the responsibilities. So as you're very familiar with, and it's interesting times to talk about central government and decision making, but a lot happens in Whitehall. But this was part of an approach that said, actually, some of the areas that are growing and changing, we're going to devolve some responsibility. We're going to give some money to places to decide what are the right outcomes for those places. And so 4 years ago, a city deal was signed, which effectively gives us up to 500 million of government funding to deliver some things that improve the economic growth of the area. Primarily about looking at connectivity, how people get about, how people move from where they live to where they want to work, how can we facilitate homes being built, how can we make sure that the jobs growth that this area has been enjoying continues. So the first 100 million was given for the first 5 years. We have that in the bank, we are spending it. Mainly to do with getting our plans in place. We have been delivering some things too, but it's for infrastructure programs, it takes a while to get going. And so we've been doing some improvements, but we're really now moving into the phase where there'll be much more delivery, and that's why the conversation that you're having is going to be really crucial to that. We obviously have to go through some checks and balances with government to make sure that we're doing what we said we'd do, and we have the first one of those over the turn of the year, and hopefully that then unlocks the next set of funding, which should come to us from April next year, the next 200 million. So the Greater Cambridge Partnership is the body that is then basically assigned with spending that money and making the decisions about what we need to do and how we need to do it. So hopefully, as you've already picked up, that's made up of Cambridge City Council, South Cambs District Council, and Cambridgeshire County Council. So we have a board made up of those representatives, but I did just want to give you a bit of context to the wider area because we get asked this question quite a lot. So where does the mayor fit into that? The mayor is responsible for a new combined authority that was set up for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and that was another devolution deal that was done with government a couple of years after our city deal, and that was signed a couple of years ago. And so the mayor, with the leaders of the councils for that whole area of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, come together to decide about things on that geography. So it's absolutely essential that we work really closely with him and the board of the combined authority. But there is a different set of responsibilities, and we're very focused on a different geography, which is around Greater Cambridge. In terms of how we make decisions, those councils have a board member. So we have 5 board members. 3 of them are representing those councils that I just outlined, and they are the voting members, so they will make decisions and sometimes vote, but on the whole, and so far, we've done everything on a consensus basis. It's also important to say that the University of Cambridge and the business community are also represented on the board. They don't have a vote, but they absolutely do contribute towards the decisions that are made. Sitting to support the board, which is the decision-making body, is a wider joint assembly, and there are 3 representatives from each of those 5 partner organisations sitting on the assembly, and they help to shape some of the decisions that are then made. In terms of the commitments that we have as a Greater Cambridge Partnership. These are ones that are particularly relevant to your discussions over the 4 days of the Citizens' Assembly. We have a target about reducing traffic congestion. The target that was set was that we need to do that by 10 to 15% based on 2011 traffic levels, and actually because of the growth that we've already seen, that's already now needing to be over 20%. So it's effectively like getting enough cars off the road so it starts to feel like every working day can be like the school holidays. That's what everybody sort of talks about. They tell us about that a lot. Why can you not just make it like school holidays? Well, that's what our aspiration is, and we need your help as to how we can do that. A rising agenda for us over the last couple of years has been that actually how can this programme help to deliver the ambitions that all our partner councils have around reducing carbon emissions, and they've set targets around that we want to try and help to deliver. And actually how can we get people out of their cars as part of that agenda and using public transport or cycling and walking more in order to achieve that. So we have targets around changing people's mode of transport in order to achieve the ambitions that we have. Final slide from me is just to say we have been talking to you and the wider community for the last couple of years about this topic. So we did a big conversation that was just understanding what were people's priorities about how they travel, how do they see public transport and other alternatives fitting into that. We then, earlier this year, had a Choices for Better Journeys engagement exercise, which again was reinforcing what the priorities are in terms of public transport and what we need to be bringing forward in order to make everybody get out of their cars where they can and use other forms of transport. We're narrowing down some of those options. This is now a really important part of that process, and as Aidan said, how it then contributes towards our decision making that we put alongside all the technical work that we're doing, alongside the other engagement and the feedback we've had. This will now help to shape the decisions that the board will make, hopefully in December of this year, about what are the steps to take to address those targets that, as I said, we've been given as part of the city deal. I'm happy to explain that over coffee if any of that didn't make any sense. I know it's complicated. Hopefully that gave you some of the context. But again, just to emphasise, as everybody else has, thank you very much for coming and taking part, because it is a really important discussion that we're trying to have, and you will make an important contribution to it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. From time to time, we've all been part of some really bad conversations where I'm sure you've kind of experienced people talking past each other, nobody actually listening to anything anybody else is saying, and nothing actually being achieved. We want this Citizen Assembly to be the opposite of that. So we want the conversations to be as productive as possible. It's partly our job and your table facilitator's job to make sure that that happens, but it's also partly your role as well to make sure that these conversations are as fruitful and productive as possible. And one of the ways that we do this are through setting some conversation guidelines, which we agree as a group. So the role of the conversation guidelines is to essentially kind of us to agree I guess the standards and the things that we think kind of make a good conversation, and the things that we're going to abide by over the next 4 days or across the 2 weekends of the Citizen Assembly to make sure that we can come up with some really good material. So you will see around the room, so there's one here that Suzannah has here, there are a few of these already started around the room, a few suggestions that we're putting forward. In a minute, we'll kind of break up into small groups and you'll be able to suggest some additional items. But just to quickly run through the things that we're suggesting. So the first one is the idea of step forwards, step back. So this is the idea that if you are somebody who tends to be a little bit shy maybe in group conversations, and you don't tend to put your point forward so much, use this opportunity to really challenge yourself to speak up a little bit more, say a bit more than you would normally. If, on the other hand, you are somebody who tends to be very comfortable in these kind of social situations, you tend to like to put your point forward, challenge yourself to maybe take a little bit of a step back and to create space for other people to also be able to have their say. So that's the first one, step forwards, step back. Second one is no question is a bad question. So the questions that we're going to be discussing over the 2 weekends is incredibly complex. There is no two ways about that. There will be lots of questions that you have, that other people have, and do not be afraid to ask that question. I can guarantee it, if you're thinking it, that somebody else in the room will also be thinking it, so you be the one to ask the question. Third one, simple one, phones away please and on silent. Obviously if you do need to take any important calls for whatever reason, then you can do so, but please do take it outside of the room, but please kind of keep phones away on your tables. The next one I've kind of already briefly touched on, respect each other's privacy. So please don't kind of report what people are saying. Please don't take photographs of other people unless they've given their permission to do so. And the last one I've also touched on. So please do talk about your experience of taking part in the Citizen Assembly, but for the time being, don't talk about any of the outcomes that it comes up with, because those we want to publish all in one go in the report. After that, you'll be free to talk as much as you like about those, about kind of recommendations and things. But for the time being, whilst until that point, we'd ask that you just talk about your experience and not the outcomes. So those are the ones that we're proposing. But it's an opportunity now for you on your tables to have a group conversation around kind of additional points that you'd like to add to the conversation guidelines. So I'm going to hand over to your table facilitators now to lead that conversation.
Thank you. Great list of guidelines. We'll get those repeated up. So now we're going to start to get into hearing from some speakers. Before we do that, I just want to give you some signals, some little techniques that we have. So whilst the speakers have been given some really tough briefs, they've been asked to speak for 10 minutes and no more, and Isabel at the back will be giving them this really brutal countdown of their time. You know, if that's not enough for them, your facilitators might also have flagged to you that on your tables you have red and yellow cards. So the yellow card means, slow down a bit, you're losing me, there's some jargon in there, so you can pull that up and wave it around, and your facilitators might also kind of help with that. And the red card means, you've lost me, just stop, let's go back a bit, okay? So we've told the speakers, try and keep it jargon-free, but, you know, we're talking about some things that will go into technical areas, so use those tools as well. So if we haven't freaked out the speakers enough, you can do that. So the other thing is that after each of the kind of set of speakers, you'll have the opportunity to write down some questions. You might want to do that as you're going. So we will have the chance to have some questions to the speakers, but they will, you know, because there's so many of us, they will be focused down. So it might be useful as you're going along, you think, oh yeah, I want to ask Lynne this, or I want to ask Stephen that. So do that. We'll also give you some time to do that at the end as well. Right, okay, so first up I think we have Stephen. Has Stephen got a clicker? And a pointer? Great. And I'm going to hand over the microphone to Stephen, who's going to talk to us about growth.
Thank you very much and good morning. Yes, it's my privilege to be your Director of Planning for both Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire, and with the terror of Isabel dragging me off and all of your red and yellow cards, I'll try and do that over the next few minutes. Some headlines for you to consider. We are a growing place. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. We're also at the heart of a very dynamic, I put cautious ecosystem, but economy, and that's partly responsible for the growth. We have a fantastic and beautiful city and beautiful villages, but they're fundamentally low density, and we have a green belt, and there are only a limited range of travel choices for some of those localities. Likewise, we all need to continue to be able to move around and access a quite dispersed set of settlements. So, helpfully, we have a local plan It's the statutory plan for the area, which sets out our current strategy about how we're proposing to do this. And this is a key document for the way that we work with the combined authority, with Rachel and the team at Greater Cambridge Partnership, with the County Council, but also it's a document that people like the water authorities and others rely upon to try and understand where the growth is going to happen. And some of the figures that you can see there encapsulate what is contained in that plan. I'll show you a little bit of where that growth is to happen in both housing and in jobs. And it is a balance. We're trying to strike balance constantly in planning between concentration and meeting need across an area. The important figure to bear in mind in this context is this one. There are going to be, over the next 15 years or so, an extra 60,000 people in this area. That's quite a lot of people. It's a Taunton, depending upon where your geography is, or it's a Margate, or a Loughborough, but it's a lot of people that are going to come to us. So our current plan, which some of you will be familiar of, we're around here at the moment, is a series of new settlements in locations that we aim to connect into this kind of Cambridge economy, growth around the edges of Cambridge, and then dispersed locations for growth across our villages and so on. And you can see from this picture here that the way that this area has responded to the question about where we live and where we work has changed over time. Between 1999 and the current plan period, Cambridge and its urban area is carrying less, it's taking less growth, and through new settlements, and particularly some dispersal in the rural areas, proportionately more. And I think you might have these slides. So in planning, we talk about, this is where the red cards come out, isn't it? Spatial choices, right, immediately. I don't know where I go from here. But all I'm trying to highlight is that in this area, we have choices about where we put things.
Can we just take this?
Yes?
Sorry, 2 slides back, you have rural including windfalls.
Yes, oh, yes, I did.
What's a windfall?
A windfall, it is. A windfall is things that are, in a sense, unexpected events that happen, where housing comes forward in locations where we haven't drawn a line around a plan, for example. And that takes up quite a lot. But it's a figure that we assume things are going to happen that aren't in the plan. Is that helpful? Sorry about that. I thought it was about this slide, spatial choices. This is really just to highlight that in a place like this, 360 or so square miles, there are choices about these matters. Having worked in London, there aren't that many choices, in fact, in London. You just choose where the underground stations are, and then you work out the kind of amount of growth that you can associate with it. But there are choices here, and those choices impact actually the nature of the conversation that you're going to have today. There are also a series of challenges, which I will canter through. How long have I got, Isabel? 5.5 minutes, perfect. I don't need to tell you some of these things, but there is a suggestion, this is a slide here, that the economy is growing faster than our ability to build houses and to house people. That means people are travelling more. People are commuting, they're having to commute into the area, and I'm sure Lynne will talk to you about in commuting as an issue as we try to think about the city and transport choices. Some sectors are growing very fast, but they're growing in very particular places. The biomedical campus and so on. We've had an enterprise zone in Camborne, which has had nothing happen in the last 5 years, and yet other places have grown very rapidly because the sectors like life sciences and so on have very specific needs, they think, about where they want to be. Recruitment is difficult. That's both a skills issue, but it does lead to people travelling further. It also means that congestion and so on are really important. And that has issues to do with affordability of housing in some localities, but particularly the city, because everyone is trying to compete for the same homes. From a housing side of things, things our strategy does do is it promotes quite a bit of new housing, but it's not necessarily where all of the jobs are, and that leads to movement. There are issues that I don't need to tell any of you in the room around housing affordability and house prices, and in fact the choice of housing. You either have to buy, or if you're lucky enough you can find somewhere to rent privately and so on. The locations are largely set by our strategy, and those strategies take some time to kind of deliver. We're not going to talk about, I thought, oh my goodness, I've put a slide together now we're not going to talk about it. But from a planning perspective, as we look forwards, this issue is going to become increasingly important, I think, in terms of some of the spatial choices, and that will drive where people move and where they choose to and are able to move to. Climate change is not just about net zero carbon, it's about climate change and the implications of that on our place, so we can't always go where we want to go. And then, this is my last slide, you'll be pleased, Isabel. I've put external factors, you could put anything really. There's loads and loads of issues that impact on us, isn't there? This is a picture of what's called the Cambridge to Oxford corridor, which is seen as an economic corridor. But the point I'm trying to make is what happens here we're not an island. Again, I'm contradicting all the points that we've just discussed in terms of keep it local, but actually from our perspective, our relationship with our surrounding areas, and in fact in a movement context, as I'm sure Lynne will say, the relationship with the surrounding areas is an important one because it impacts the way that people behave and the way that people travel. Things like technology and the choices that people have, both organisations globally, some of our organisations are globally mobile in some respects, and the people that associate with them likewise, are important considerations for us as we think about the kind of transport solutions and transport opportunities that we offer. Thank you.
Little ripple, little ripple. Thank you, Stephen. So just a reminder, if you've got questions that are coming up, jot them down. That will help you. We'll give you some time after we've heard from Lynne. Just wanted to reflect on something that Stephen said. So the point about climate, it will come up in conversations. It does affect it. We are going to hear from a speaker later about environment. I suppose the point I wanted to make is we're not centrally just talking about climate change, but of course it has an impact. So same rules apply for Lynne. She's on speaker countdown on timing and the red and yellow cards. So Lynne's going to talk to us a bit more again about the wider context of growth and economy in Cambridge. Thank you.
Morning, thanks for having me. So my name is Lynne Miles. I'm an economist, planner and transport planner. Right now I work at the GCP. I'm seconded in for a period. My employer actually is ARUP, which is a consultancy, and so over the last couple of years as ARUP we've done bits and bobs of technical work supporting GCP, thinking about transport, the economy, public transport, how we deal with things. So I'm sort of here talking about some of the evidence we've collected over the course of doing that. The first point to make, I suppose, and I don't really need to tell any of you this, is that congestion is a bit of a problem in Cambridge. So it's been a problem for a while. It's been getting slowly more severe over the past few years. The cordon count around the city of counting people who come in suggests about 200,000 vehicles come into Cambridge every day. It's about 10% higher now than it was in 1995. It did plateau off for a while. So there was a point in time between about 96 and 2013 where the number of cars sort of wasn't rising, it was about static. But over the last few years it started to tick up again as we absorbed a lot of growth. We've got some information about how people move in and around the city. So we know that about half of the trips in the city of Cambridge are not passing through, they're not coming to Cambridge, they're not leaving to Cambridge, they're just movements within the city. So there's a lot of people sort of as a tidal flow coming in, but there's also a lot of people doing movements around within the city. The challenge for me to have 10 minutes to talk to you about transport is like the the temptation is to give you a load of pie charts and stats, and I don't want to do that, but there are packs on your table that you can refer to over the weekend that have got a few pie charts and stats which just give you some basic information about traffic in Cambridge. But the first thing I want to show you is just a map of congestion in Cambridge, actually. So hopefully if the videos work, and technology always lets you down, but if they do work, it'll show gradually going through the day a Google map of average traffic and how it runs. So let's cross our hands here. It's getting running 7 o'clock in the morning, Canterton Top, 8 o'clock, getting worse, 9 o'clock it's bad, still bad at 10 o'clock, quite a broad spread of badness in the morning there. Carries on being quite bad throughout the day. So actually, although there's a peak, it carries on being quite bad. We're at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock now. You can still see quite a lot of amber on all the roads around. And as we get into the evening, it gets pretty bad again. And actually, it carries on being bad. Doesn't clear up really until about 8 o'clock in the evening. So you've got this fairly constant level of jam on the roads, and you know that because most of you probably sit in it quite a lot of the time. And it's not just in the centre of the city, it's about the roads coming into the city. So there are pinch points outside, around Grant Park and around Madingley Mulch, where you get big bottlenecks of people coming into the city, and it's not a lot of fun for anyone, actually. So that's a point worth making, that it's just really pretty miserable to sit in that traffic. We have seen people start to move away from the car, though. So this blue line that goes along here, it's just on a relative scale. It's not an actual number of movements, so it's relative to jobs. The number of cars has been growing over all this time, since 2001 to 2017, but that red line there is our estimate of what it would have been if there hadn't been some people moving out of their cars and onto other modes. So there has been some success in getting people out of cars, but the line's still going upwards, right? So we haven't at any point started to really go downwards. You have blips associated with a sort of economic cycle. And it isn't in every place. So just as one example, this is some traffic survey data we've been collecting, GCP have been collecting for 10 years. And this happens to show Granta Park, but it's the same situation in a number of other locations. That orange line at the top tells you what proportion of people travel to work by car. It's consistently between 80 and 90%, and it's more or less been a flat line for 10 years. Don't read too much into this specific number because it's a sample, and so you'll have some minor variation. So it's been flat across the top, and this is every other mode across the bottom. So on average, we're getting some mode shift, but in places particularly where there isn't a lot of public transport there to help you out, flatline, despite travel planning, cycle lanes, all the things that we're trying to do to sort of encourage people out of their cars, fairly static. This, if it works, there you go. See that white blob in the middle? That's showing you how far you can get in public transport in this amount of time to the centre of Cambridge. So I think the point I want to make with this is if you let it run all the way through to the end, we're in an hour and a half now, and you haven't got that far, actually. Public transport accessibility to the city is not that great. So if you were to run that through, I can run it through again if it's helpful. What happens is, after about half an hour, let's see if it'll run again. Let's see if I can. So we've got to, I will pause it. Half an hour. Oh, it hasn't paused, sorry. Actually, this is user error, not technology. About half an hour's travel time, if you're trying to get to a point right in the centre of the city, you actually, oh, for goodness sake, haven't got very far. So you can more or less get to the centre of the city from anywhere in Cambridge in half an hour, but there are very few places outside the city that you can reasonably get in half an hour, which is not a bad travel time. And actually, if you needed to get anywhere other than the centre of the city, if you had an onward journey from there, it would be longer by public transport. You can get a bit further out north and south. You can see that you can hit some other villages. That mostly reflects the railway line. If you want to go in east and west, you can't really get in a reasonable travel time. So this isn't about people being good or bad or what have you. It's just about what's there for them to make the choices that we ideally might want them to make. So we'll just let that run through again. And that's even more the case for the employment locations that aren't bang in the centre of the city, which, if we look back to Stephen's stuff, is most of the ones where the employment's going to be in the future. So this shows a similar concept. Everything you can see in orange up here is where you can get within 45 minutes from the biomedical campus. It's not too bad for Cambridge, but there's significant chunks of Cambridge over there that you can't, which are quite close, but within 45 minutes you can't really get there. Nowhere out here, sort of in this part of South Cambridgeshire, can you get to the biomed in 45 minutes. Nowhere over here. So actually, it's just not possible. And this is where there's 14,000 jobs are planned for the biomedical campus to 2030. This shows the same for the science park. So what you can see really clearly here is if you live along that corridor that comes into Cambridge, on the sort of in the angle that the science park is, you're all right. But if you live anywhere else, you're absolutely stuck for getting there on public transport. And this is West Cambridge where we are now. So again, if you happen to live on the 428 Madingley Road, then you're okay for public transport. But what you can't do really, can I see that? Can't really cross the city to get out to the other side. And it's crossing the city for a transport point of view, which is really important. So it's really hard to cross the city centre and get out the other side on public transport in a reasonable amount of time. So you've got two problems which make it hard to cross the city, stylistically. One is that the buses are sitting in the same traffic as everyone else, and they're sort of grinding along through the city. So even if you use the busway, for example, it goes terribly quickly, gets into the city, slows down, because it's just with all the other cars. And the problem is one and the same, really. Over here, this shows the width of roads in Cambridge City, over here. So the red one's very narrow, and the orange ones are pretty narrow. There just isn't really any space to separate out that traffic. There just isn't. We're not going to be bulldozing historic Cambridge. There's nowhere to make space for the buses to get around. So you need to either somehow make space that the buses can travel or the public transport can travel separately without being disrupted, or you need to get some cars out of the way so that that public transport can go quicker. So that's what we're thinking of. How do we make space for public transport to go more quickly? Either by creating new spaces where they're unhindered, or by getting cars out of their way. And this is my last slide, so Isabel doesn't have to use her next card, hopefully. This is just looking forward. 44,000 jobs is what I want to leave you with. It's a lot more cars on the road if we do nothing, and there aren't obvious, simple fixes. So this red line here takes one estimate of traffic, the cordon count growth. It's been growing, it's been going upwards. This is 2011, the target we want to be 15% more of. This is where we are now. It's been going up, not as fast as population, which is blue. So population has been growing quickly. We've been doing something. We haven't been growing in traffic terms as fast as we have in population terms, but it's always upwards. And then that dotted band of red is our estimate of where we will be with all this growth if we don't do anything substantial to public transport and getting cars off the road. And that green box at the bottom there is where we want to be if we hit that 10 to 15% target. So that's where we think we're going, and this is where we need to be to hit the target. And I guess today is about thinking about what it is we do to get us from there to there. And that's me.
Great. Thank you. So now you get a chance to just have a discussion back at your tables for about half an hour. I want you to do a couple of things. Your table facilitators will go through this with you. Is reflect a little bit on what you've heard so far and consider some of the questions that in half an hour or so we'll direct towards Lynne and Stephen. But also, I want you to start thinking about the impacts that you see, because you live here too. So in a minute, after lunch, we're going to hear about impacts from a range of speakers. But you're sitting on those impacts too. So let's start to hear from you about what those are as well. So facilitators, we've got about half an hour for that. Okay? Okay. Are all the table facilitators good to go? Yeah? Okay, Tim's out of the room. I think Isabel has a speaker. Lynne, Stephen, do you want to come and stand up here? So thank you for starting your impacts lists. We will come back to that this afternoon. So don't worry if not everything came through. So how we're going to do this is that we will, I'll come to each table and I will ask if you have a question for Stephen, and then the next table, question for Lynne, and then we will go round and spend the time asking those questions. So, table 4. Do you have a question for Stephen?
Stephen, we would like to know. No pressure. But we would like to know why, when you're planning where housing is going and where jobs are going to be, you don't consider infrastructure needs at the same time and perhaps plan the infrastructure before you plan the housing and the jobs.
So that's a very straightforward question. The answer is we do. And in fact, we do quite a bit of modelling sitting in the evidence base that underpins it. What we also need to consider is that if the quantum of development is able to justify the enhancements necessary for the infrastructure. So, for example, people are probably familiar with the fact that most of the large sites pay contributions towards education and transport and community infrastructure, as well as the environmental enhancements. And we do some modelling around that. But it is an iterative process, because once you reach a certain scale, the development is unable to fund that infrastructure on its own. And one of the things I should have highlighted is that alongside the local plan that we adopted, we actually prepared with the County Council a transport strategy, which was adopted at the same time, that effectively identifies the transport investments necessary. And the Greater Cambridge Partnership's role is in part informed by that transport strategy in terms of the delivery of that infrastructure. So the best case in point is probably Bourne Airfield and Camborne West, where the local plan said that's an appropriate place to growth, provided we can connect Bourne Airfield and Camborne West back into Cambridge through a public transport corridor. It's quite a controversial issue at the moment, but that is the rationale, rather than, for example, eat into, for example, the green belt of Cambridge. So we do.
Thank you. So coming to table 7, have you got a question for Lynne?
For Lynne, our question is, it appears that you've managed to get people out of their cars and into other modes of transport. How's this been done?
Okay, so a bit people have got out of their cars and onto other modes of transport, probably not as much as we would have liked. There are quite a lot of things that have gone on over the last few years, and I think there's been quite a lot of stuff that I would probably characterise as relatively incremental investment. So there's been some things like there's been the core city scheme in the very city centre of the city, in the historic part. It's been closed to traffic, car traffic. There's been quite a big expansion of park and ride sites around the area. There's been quite a lot of investment and promotion of cycling. Everyone will know Cambridge is a cycling city. That happens a lot. There have been investments associated, as Stephen said, with certain developments. There's been the busway, which has taken a chunk of traffic out. There has been a general national move slightly towards public transport as people become aware. Am I missing anything? There's a bunch of things. There's lots of travel planning at local areas as well. So lots of specific employers. Sometimes some schools are running minibuses that go from park and ride sites into their school. So there's been a lot of small efforts which collectively have started to shift things. But I think probably in order to sort of stop that line from going upwards and start going downwards, we need to do something slightly bigger.
Thank you. Thank you also, speakers, for keeping it quite brief. And then we can move on. So table 8, have you got a table? Have you got a question for Stephen?
We have. The question is, what is the reason for the increase in dispersed development?
Well, the reason is in some respects, that was the choice that the politicians, but the local community voted for. So fundamentally, there are spatial choices, as are highlighted. The location and decision to grow places like Northstowe and to create new towns, effectively, or new settlements or expanded settlements in Waterbeach to the north and Camborne West and Bourne, was born out of a choice that either we add significant density to the city, so we densify the existing built-up area of the city, we take more of the green belt away for new development close to the city, or we disperse growth out to those new settlements. And the other alternative is you disperse and share all of the growth across all of the villages surrounding the city. There's a balance, and you'll have seen that all of those strategies are effectively deployed. The precise balance was one that was arrived at through the process of preparing local plan. It took us 8 years and was a highly contested process, with some people saying we should take more of the greenbelt away, or we should build just beyond the greenbelt. Some people saying, well, we should have more dispersed growth, and others saying we should densify the city. So it is a series of choices in which the balance is defined by how we think we can bring the most sustainable mix forward. The benefit of larger settlements or new settlements is the ability to efficiently connect them with infrastructure, whether that's both utilities and water, but also that at a scale they can provide the education and community infrastructure, and importantly the public transport connectivity that's necessary to make them more integrated in the place.
Great, thank you. Table 5. Have you got a question for Lynne?
We do. So this is a little bit left field, so, but I hope you don't mind. So we had a question and a brief discussion about how public transport systems are owned, and so at the present they're basically public sector systems which are funded publicly. But what scope is there for sort of local communities to contribute to co-own, to set up their own public transport facilities and systems? Could that be part of the sort of mix of the public transport economy, I guess?
So I think there are two main points to make there, and I'm not a public transport operations specialist. The buses are run as private, deregulated systems. The private sector runs them. By and large, unless you choose to subsidise a particular route for some reason, they run what they want to run in the way they want to run them. The potential for communities to set up their own public transport systems, I don't know a lot about. We might call on some of the experts later to get that answered. But the other point to make is broadly, you can correct me if I'm wrong in this, I think there are almost no public transport systems in the world that operate profitably. So always they are somehow supported by something, particularly buses. They're supported by communities, they're supported by decisions of local government. Perhaps David will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think generally speaking, it's a difficult thing to run a public transport system that isn't somehow supported by someone. Sorry, I'm not more of an expert on bus franchising and what have you.
Okay, we can come back to that if we need to. So table 6, have you got a question for Stephen?
Yes, Stephen, what is your transport plan for growth 2018 to 31? So you alluded to that on one of the slides.
So, as I referenced, sorry, I should have clarified it. There is an adopted statutory local transport plan that dovetails with the local plan strategy for growth. Fundamentally, that transport plan is the programme that Greater Cambridge Partnership and the County Council have been implementing. The combined authority, and others might be able to clarify, have just produced a new draft local transport plan for the whole of Cambridgeshire. But it again, fundamentally, sits on top of the growth strategy that we've set out. The transport strategy is obviously a balance of both investment in road space, but also measures to promote public transport and mode shift. And Peter and others may comment on that later. But the two documents, there is an adopted local transport plan that makes assumptions that are included in the local plans, and the orbital connections that both to the west and to the south and the north, things like investment in connecting Waterbeach and into the Cambridge area, connecting Bourne and Camborne West, connecting to the south, the biomedical campus to the villages to the south. They are part of that strategy.
Okay, table 3, have you got a question for Lynne?
Yep. So we were wondering if anyone has actually surveyed anyone using cars about town, where they've come from and where they're going to.
Yes, right. So there's a bunch of places you get data about where people are coming from and coming to. One of the best sources is the census. which gives you in really good detail where people are going from and where they're going to for their travel to work. The drawbacks of the census is that it's only once every 10 years, and the last one was 2011, so it's quite old now. And it only tells you about travel to work. It doesn't tell you about leisure travel or travel to hospitals or any of the other travel that people do. As well as that, Travel for Cambridgeshire runs an annual survey of various people at various locations. That gives you much more recent information, and you can ask people about their attitudes and why they do what they do, and we know some stuff there. And I think the plan is to present some of that in weekend 2, so that you've got some of that information. The drawback is then you've got a smaller sample. It's less reliable in terms of being completely comprehensive. But over the last 2 years, Greater Cambridge Partnership have done 2 specific bespoke surveys. One was in 2017, called Our Big Conversation, which asked a lot of people how they travel, why they choose that mode of travel, what might make them choose something different, what are the factors that influence their choices. More recently, earlier this year, there was another survey which asked people more about their travel behaviours and their opinions. So we've got, and I think for the Our Big Conversation survey, there were about 10,000 responses. It's quite a lot of data on what and how people are happening. But it's always from different sources. You're always looking across a couple of different sources to build a picture. We don't have a sort of surveillance state where we follow everyone everywhere, so we don't always know definitively.
Okay, yeah? Does that answer that question? Yeah? Okay, table 2. Have you got a question for Stephen?
Yes. There were quite a few questions for Stephen, some of which have been addressed. There were some observations about what's your park and ride strategy, which kind of related to the institutional. Do you build the infrastructure and then put in the houses at the moment? So it's where are the best sites for park and ride? Why isn't park and ride where some of the people are living? And there was a very late point, which I've just added, because it came off of our impacts in the local travel situation, which is that there are some institution-led shuttle buses knocking around, but why is not wider use of park and ride sites by those vehicles as well?
So the planning authority is not responsible for the park and rides. There is a project looking at the role of park and ride in our transport solutions going forwards, because we recognise that the use of park and rides in some cases the park and rides are full, and the reasoning behind that is being explored in terms of what that means for new park and ride opportunities. So the planning authority, park and rides are operated by the county council, I think, and obviously served by the bus operators. The way that we view the role of park and ride informs the way that the transport strategy for the area will be put together. Clearly, park and rides require planning permission, but the process of arriving at the right location and the right size, and indeed even the right format for park and rides now and in the future, is something that I think GCP are looking at this moment in time.
Lynn wants to chip in.
Yeah, just really quickly, there's an art to picking a park and ride site. You want it to be close enough in that the onward journey doesn't take you too long, because people are going to be really annoyed if they have to start quickly into their journey and then take a very long bus ride. But you want it far enough out that it collects traffic before the traffic gets really bad in the city. So from that point of view, you're always tactically thinking, where's the best location? There are a couple of new proposed park and ride sites that are on the decks at the moment, and they're trying to strike that balance, but they're trying to be associated with new transport schemes coming into the city, so that then you've got a park and ride that picks people up and brings them in on a really good route.
Okay, thank you. And Lizzie, did you have a question for Lynn?
Yes, we did. So our main question was, if there is already a huge problem with congestion from 6 a.m. until 9 p.m, why are 33,500 new homes being built and the impact that they will have? I don't know if it's a question.
So there's a little bit of from my point. I mean, so essentially what happens is if this area is growing economically and everyone wants to move here, they're going to come and want to move here. And if you don't deal with the fact that you can't stop people wanting to come and move here, if you don't accommodate for that growth, what you'll get is people from outside bidding up house prices and forcing people out. So you've got to accommodate growth as it is, with the exception of people living in social housing, where they're sometimes more constrained to where they live. Everyone else can go and live where they want, and the local people will feel the consequences of that if you don't accommodate it.
Do you want to add anything to that, Stephen, or is that?
Not much, but just to say, in many respects, the challenge of this area is that house price inflation and housing affordability is as pronounced in many ways as the challenges associated with congestion and population. But because this area is so important nationally, effectively Cambridge isn't in a position where it can put a brake on that. The national significance of this place and its attractiveness as an economy means that the government has an important interest in seeing it continue to grow, but more significantly, the realisation of some of the things that we know we need to do around skills, around moving towards low carbon economies and so on, are a means of achieving that. Growth has a role to play.
Okay, I am riskily going to go round the tables again because I know that some tummies might be rumbling, but I think that there are some more questions to go. So coming back to table 4, have you got a question for Lynne this time?
Lynne, we had lots of questions for you.
Oh my goodness. I'll stay for lunch and we can chat about them.
Well, in fact, one of them was, could you stay for an extra 10 minutes? Because
Sure.
they wanted to hear loads from you. But actually, our main question that we're going to ask is around your last slide with the green bar. Mm-hmm. And it's like, actually, what will need to change to make that a reality?
Really, a lot of people need to stop driving and start walking or cycling or taking public transport. But it's got to be public transport they want to get on. And I'm going to use your question to say, I didn't answer your question. I told you about where we get the data from and not what it says. What it says is that people that drive, when we ask them what would make them pay for public transport, they say, if it were faster, if it were more reliable, and if it were cheaper. That's what they tell us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Simple.
You can all go home. We're done here.
No, you can't go home. Oh no, you don't get out of it that easily. Right, table 7. Have you got a question for Stephen, please?
We do. So will there be new offices and workspaces as well as residential provision in Northstowe and other new developments?
There will, and increasingly what we are, the economy is growing beyond Cambridge core. The economy is actually now growing faster in South Cambridgeshire than it is in the city. And part of what we're trying to do at the moment is work out the right type of balance of employment and so on, so that we can internalise some of those trips and people don't need to leave the settlements. It's fair to say that the house building sector is most interested in building houses, and so the planning authority is increasingly, with GCP and the combined authority, looking to explore how can we ensure that the employment space comes forward at a commensurate rate with the new homes, so that people don't need to leave the places where they choose to live. But it is part of the current programme trying to integrate that.
Great, thank you. Table 8. Question for Lynne.
We do have a few questions for Lynne, and first of all, apologies to my table that I didn't check with them which of these 3 questions I should prioritise, so I'm just going to take a punt and
the
hope
other
that
2,
they're not too angry.
You can come and grab me in the
table,
break.
you can punish Penny later.
Okay, so building actually on what you just said about how to solve the problem and get us within that green bar, the question is, people need to use public transport, but services are being cut and prices are going up. Why?
Right. Public transport is really expensive to run. Almost no one does it profitably. It's particularly difficult, expensive to run when you've got quite a dispersed population, as you do here. When you've got a small city, actually, with not that many people to provide the fare income to run the services, and they are spread around quite a large area, which is predominantly small villages, that's an incredibly hard thing to serve well on public transport. So to make public transport run in a way that is financially viable, we're accustomed to thinking that as a thing that really only happens well in cities because there's the density of people to support it. So if you want a rural bus service that serves you quickly and well, it's incredibly difficult to do that. There aren't enough people to get on it, pay the fare to do it. And at the moment, these services are run privately, and by and large, private companies decide what they use. The county has some money to subsidise rural bus services, but they are increasingly, all local authorities are incredibly under pressure for money at the moment. Local government has had more cuts over the last 10 years than any Whitehall department has had, and there's just no money. There has to be some money coming in to support the system.
Okay. By the way, Peter Blake and David Metz, if at any points there are like, oh, I need to add to this, then please flag, put your hand up. Because I know these guys are in the spotlight at the moment. That's okay, but do flag. Okay, so table 5. Question for Stephen.
Yep. So what determines employment growth, and can it be reduced?
I'm glad you're answering that.
I'm not an economist. Effectively, the unique properties of this area are the clusters and the global expertise that exist. The universities are an absolutely critical part of that narrative. Nothing truer than success breeds success. Some of the people that we talk to either come to this area because of who's already here, but actually more than anything, the success of Cambridge is the success of the city in its ability to be able to grow enterprises from here. Companies like ARM, let's remember, are Cambridge companies. They were created by people from the university. Some of the people that we talk to are growing so fast because of the world-leading research and so on, that people who were spoke to somebody recently who had 2 people 5 years ago. They've now got 250, and they need to grow faster. So there are some really big questions around, do we want to sustain those companies here, or are we happy to see them go elsewhere in the world? Because the realities for some of those companies are they are globally mobile. So the university and who is already here has a really important part to play. The biomedical campus is a case in point, but the clustering and the network are critical and quite unique components of why this area is the area it is. And both nationally and then internationally, that is a really important, in a sense, USP for this part of the country, which government would be keen to sustain because of obviously the challenges that we've had ahead. So I don't determine any of that. In some respects, you could say the planning service is a responsive service, because what we're trying to do is to make sure that that growth can happen in a way that is thoughtful, integrated and structured, and importantly doesn't compromise the existing place and the constituents and parties and communities that are already here. So it's a tough balance, but planning is here to try and enable good things to happen. Many would say it enables lots of negatives, but the economy and supporting the economy for future generations as well as for current residents is an important part of that.
I mean, sure, a really good way to get traffic off the roads is to have a recession. So you always have lots less cars on the road when there's a recession. But I think we're probably working in a framework where we think that's not the first policy tool we want to use to get us to a good place.
Okay, thank you, Lynne and Stephen. So table 6, question for Lynne.
So you've mentioned about the city centre congestion right in the city. Have you considered restricted delivery times for the city?
Lots of things are on the table at the moment, and I don't think it's my role right now, right at the beginning, to start telling you a list of things that I might think I might do to fix this as a technical person. I think we're going to be much more focused on that in weekend 2 about what are the solutions. Certainly that is an option, restricting. All the options you can think of come with pros and cons, and they help in one way and then they make it worse in another way. So I think it's not my role to do that balancing.
Is it fair to say that we are principally looking at cars and people moving around, but that delivery is a factor in that? I'm just wondering how much of a problem is kind of delivery vehicles versus commuters and
for traffic
and
coming
moving
into the city, 86% of it is cars. But it depends what you're trying to get. We've got Rachel talked about 3 objectives, so reducing congestion, improving public transport, and sorting out air quality and not contributing to climate change. So if you're concerned about air quality and climate change, actually delivery vehicles make a really large contribution to that. And so you can tackle that problem quite quickly with measures that are sort of focused on buses and HGVs and LGVs and what have you, but you don't necessarily fix congestion, for which probably the volume of the traffic is cars.
Great, thank you. And yes, we're starting to kind of get into that territory of some of the issues, which will definitely be the focus of next week. So table 3, am I on table 3? Yeah. Question for Stephen.
Yep, so our one was about kind of rurality and people living in small places where there's maybe only a post box and a church, and kind of connectivity to other small places, so kind of cycleways, footways. Is that something that's considered in planning, and is there potential for that to be made better in the future?
It is. I suppose there's an issue about proportionality, but certainly what you will have seen in recent years is increasingly objectives about connecting smaller settlements to one another. You'll have seen cycle paths. Girton, for example, has a cycle link between villages, and that is part of a strategy. We've seen in South Cambridgeshire particularly a number of speculative proposals come forward in villages because of a lack of what's called a 5-year housing, I'm going to get a red card now, 5-year land supply, which has allowed developers to essentially get permission in places that they wouldn't have otherwise done so from our plan. But in granting those permissions, we have sought to get contributions and funding from developers that seek to try and improve connectivity. It is a dispersed, it's 360 square miles across South Cambridgeshire with 105 parishes, and that is quite a challenge to kind of connect it. So the other thing that we're starting to think about is how can we improve the sustainability, or in a sense the ability of those settlements to sustain themselves, with thinking around not just because people are increasingly retailing online, but actually workspace, employment space. It's trying to think about the new houses that come to there to enrich in those communities with to ensure that you can live a full and long life in that settlement, rather than have to travel outwards all of the time. So, and that's a matter of planning policy that I think will be explored even further through the next plan.
Thank you. Right, last 2 tables to go. Table 2, question for Lynne, please. Well, if you have one.
Yeah, Lynne, we had something that I'm sort of going to segue from, because you said you're not talking about potential solutions today, which was how do we use school run car use. But there was a broader question that kind of falls within that envelope, which is why do people drive into the city in the first place? You know, this 86% car use that you mentioned.
Most of them say it's faster. Some of them say it's because they've got no other alternative. There's a really interesting, bigger question about people's behaviour. I think it's not something I'm an expert in. There's a lot of behavioural science going on around nudges and things like that. How can you get people to change their behaviours? There's a lot we don't know about why people travel the way they do, sometimes when it's not obviously the best choice. Anecdotally, a lot of people like the personal space and the privacy and the flexibility. We do know quite a lot of people are very often doing multi-purpose trips. So a lot of people aren't just driving to work. They're going shopping on the way home. They might be popping in to care for an elderly relative. They might have to do childcare pickups. At the moment, the public transport system generally won't cater well for those sort of linked trips, as you call them in the jargon. So there's an element of that as well. How can you make the public transport system allow for that a bit better? But by and large, at the moment, honestly, I think people are driving because they can.
Great, thank you. And Lizzie, final question for Stephen, please.
Yeah, I think our main one has been answered or touched on already, to do with sort of homes and how the employment kind of sector is keeping up with that. So another question we had was, which companies are the biggest future employers, and what's their advice for current employees and around the challenges, if you know?
I think if I could answer who's going to be the greatest success, I wouldn't be the director of planning, I'd be a fund manager. But But I think what we can say is that sectors that are growing at the greatest rate tend to be area specific. So they are around life sciences and digital is growing quite importantly in Cambridge as well. But probably our greatest significance is in the world of kind of genomics and life sciences and so on, and quite possibly with NIAB and others, agritech, or what's called agritech. So companies forming in those sectors. And the university, Cambridge University, I think is providing quite significant support in terms of the commercialisation of some of the research. That's why you get 2 people at the inception, those companies growing very fast, because those global sectors are able to access global finance in a way that perhaps more traditional sectors like agriculture and food production can't, because it is we're at the very beginning of some of those areas. Does that answer the question? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah. I think there was just a particular bit as well as, I guess, just a particular point as well as to some kind of what are those companies doing, and or in terms of actual like advice or contributing for employees.
So where we are with that is importantly as well, where are those companies choosing to be? Because I think for pertinent for today's conversation, where are those companies located? Well, they're less and less located in the centre of Cambridge, in fact. Where they are located and where they're choosing or looking to grow are in the perimeter sites, like the biomedical campus, but actually in the research institutes at Babraham and Wellcome and so on, to the south of the city. The Cambridge Science Park and the area around northeast Cambridge. Obviously, there's potential to grow in West Cambridge, and of course the Cambridge Airport and marshals have indicated their intention to potentially relocate elsewhere. So what we're seeing, as I said earlier, is actually the fastest economic growth now in South Cambridgeshire, even in some of the villages like Melbourne, with the science park there expanding significantly. And that poses both opportunities, because people potentially won't need to travel into the city, but it also poses challenges because those places are less well connected sometimes than existing places. What we do know is that at this moment in time, as I think I said earlier, the choices that those enterprises make about where they go are quite narrow. That they do, the people will consider Cambridge Science Park, but they won't consider a site 2 miles away. People will consider the biomedical campus, but they won't consider a site in Haverhill and so that specificity, is that a word? Yes. But that very, very fixed view about where they want to be is one that we only can have a certain amount of influence on. But one of the things that it relates to is also where their employees want to be. And the ease of access, which Cambridge is now suffering challenges with, is sometimes a reason why those companies might move further out from the city. And that's going to be an increasing dynamic.
Thank you, Stephen. So thank you, Lynne and Stephen, for being grilled adequately by everybody. So every time we hear speakers, we'll have a Q&A session. We've been quite generous with time, and that's why your facilitators will be quite brutal about the questions. But I think hopefully you've had quite a rounded session there. So just a couple of things before you go to lunch. In your packs, and your facilitators will give them to you, is a sort of a crib sheet of some key facts and figures that we thought...
I've been cheating from it.
That might be a kind of handy, useful thing that after you've finished your lunch, you might want to peruse and keep with you. So you will have that. Lunch is outside, and sort of if you head back towards the exit, there are 2 stations of food. They both have the same thing on them. So go to the one with the smallest queue, and you will get your food. If you have allergies, so 2 things. There are plenty of chefs around who will, if you've got I really need to know, has this not got X in it? But also, posted up outside by the stations, and I think just on the wall as you go down, is like an allergy sheet where you can look and it says, if you're allergic to celery, don't eat this option. But essentially, all of your options, you should be able to get something at the stations. If you have any concerns, ask the chef. So if you can do that. And then finally, can you make sure that we are back here by 1:35 in your seats, ready to go? The first speaker will start to happen at that point. So you've got just under, you've got about 45 minutes or so for your lunch. Okay, thank you very much and see you after lunch.
Hopefully you're all well fed and ready for the afternoon. So before we kick off with a few more presentations, we've just got a few announcements to make. So the first one is about the live streaming. You might have noticed that we've got a camera up at the front here. It's only kind of pointed towards the people speaking from the front, so you won't appear on it at any point, and it's only broadcasting the kind of the presentations and the introductions and things from the front. But all of essentially it's live broadcasting up to Facebook as we speak. But after, all of the Boris, who's doing the live streaming, will be kind of cutting together all of the clips. So if you want to go back and see any of the presentations, then they'll all be put up on the Consult Cams website, and you'll be able to go back and look at them at your leisure. A few people have also asked for the slides from the presentations as well. Those will also be published on the Consult Cams website for anybody to access. But in the meantime, so you have kind of early access to them, we've put them in a Dropbox folder, which just means that you can kind of access them via these links that have now been put around the room. So it's the bit.ly /Greater Cambridge 2019. So if you just go to that on your internet browser, you'll then be able to download all of the slides from the presentations from today. So this morning in my introduction, I briefly kind of mentioned that we have a couple of expert leads. But now is the time to give them a little bit of a fuller introduction, because they're playing a really important role for us throughout the 2 weekends. So they are David Metz, who we will hear from a little bit later today, actually, because he's filling in for a speaker who sadly can't come because she's ill. But David is from University College London, from the Transport Department, and so he's kind of an external expert who will be able to help to advise you throughout the 2 weekends. He's there as kind of an expert on tap. So if at any point you have a question that needs to be addressed around, I guess, the issues that we're talking about, then David will do his best to address that. We also have Peter Blake, who's sat at the back there. So Peter is from the Greater Cambridge Partnership. He's the Director of Transport. So he's able to give more of, I guess, the local context and more of the kind of background around kind of transport in Cambridge. And again, Peter will be available for both weekends as kind of an expert on tap for you to ask questions as they come up. And particularly, I guess, tomorrow and during the second weekend, they'll be giving some presentations as well. I think the final thing that I need to mention before we go on to the speakers are the unanswered questions. So obviously you generated quite a lot of questions before for the speakers. You'll generate more kind of questions for the following speakers, and we're not going to be able to get to all of those. But we are going to take them away. We're going to have a look at them. If lots of tables come up with a very similar question that hasn't been answered, then we'll make sure we can get a response to that question between the weekends and share that with you. We're not going to be able to answer all of the questions, but we'll look for kind of where there might be kind of key, kind of common questions that come out from the tables. Okay, so without further ado, we'll move on to the next round of speakers. So in the morning, you start to think about the impacts of kind of congestion and kind of poor mobility choices yourselves. But now we're going to hear from a number of different experts to give different perspectives on those impacts. So the first speakers we'll hear from, they're doing a bit of a double act, so we'll hear from Joe Dix and Liz Robin, who are going to give a perspective on the impact on people's health of congestion and of the issues that we discussed earlier around transport. So I'll hand over to you to kick off.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. So I'm Joe Dix. I've worked on air quality at the Cambridge City Council for about 20 years, so I should know something about it. This is obviously quite a complex subject, air quality, so I'm quite expecting you to perhaps hold up red cards, and please feel free to do so, but I will be around to answer questions later, so bear that in mind also. Okay, so why are we worried about air quality? I'm not going to dwell on this because my colleague, Dr. Liz Robin, is going to talk in much more detail about health immediately after me. But air quality affects our health. In Cambridgeshire, the key number you really need to know is in the greater Cambridge area, there are about 106 premature deaths a year that can be attributed to air quality. And that's quite a complex thing that Liz will talk about a bit more. So I'm not going to dwell on the health aspects, but that's why we're interested in air quality. Okay, as a result of the health problems, there are a number of legal objectives set by government around different pollutants, and it's up to the local authority to measure those pollutants and then set out a plan to do something about it. And all of this work around transport is very important in meeting those health-based legal objectives. Now, there are quite a few pollutants on there, some of which have been dealt with historically. A good example is lead at the bottom there. Lead used to be a big constituent of motor fuels. It was phased out in the late 1980s, and so it's no longer a problem. And that's the case for quite a few of those pollutants. There are actually only two that we're really concerned about in Cambridge, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on today. And they are nitrogen dioxide and a more general pollutant, particulate matter, which is small dust. Okay, so the first of those pollutants, nitrogen dioxide, it's a gas formed whenever you burn anything in air. You might remember from school that air is largely made up of nitrogen and oxygen. Whenever you burn something in air, some of the nitrogen combines with the oxygen and it forms a number of nitrogen species that some of which are toxic. So nitrogen dioxide is the one we're most concerned about because it causes inflammation of the lungs and so on. And the main sources are road transport, particularly because if you combine nitrogen and oxygen under very high temperature and pressure in an engine, you get nitrogen dioxide or oxides of nitrogen. Secondly, particulate matter, that's something slightly easier to understand. It's largely very small dusts. We're interested in the very, very small particles, smaller than 10 microns, which we call PM10, smaller than 2.5 microns, which we call PM2.5, and they're responsible for a whole range of health issues, and there are standards that we're trying to meet for those. So I'm only going to really try and tell you three things. I'm going to tell you what the sources of pollution are in Cambridge, because you have to understand those if you're going to actually try and tackle them. So firstly, if we look at all sources of both those two pollutants I've mentioned, if you look at the first pie chart, that large pink-purple area is about 3/4 of the source of nitrogen oxides in Cambridge are down to road sources, so vehicle sources. The second largest chunk is regional background, so that's nitrogen dioxide that's come from outside Cambridge. Red is generally domestic burning and commercial burning in boilers, and there's a very thin sliver there, green, which is industrial sources. And if you look at PM10, actually, the sources from the rest of the country are very dominant, and there's only a small proportion that are locally derived. So the purple and red you can see up there are the locally derived section. And again, transportation, road transport is the dominant source. But as you can see, there's a smaller amount that we can actually influence locally. So if we then take that traffic element and we look at that in a bit more detail, so how does that break down? Which bits of the transport system are responsible for how much pollution? If you look inside the inner ring road of Cambridge, so the very centre, the historic core of Cambridge, the blue and the green, which make up about 50% of the local sources of nitrogen dioxide in this case, they are attributable to buses. And the next biggest chunk, orange, is diesel cars. And there are other significant contributors. So red on there is taxis. And although there are a small number of individual vehicles, they are still a significant source. If you look outside the inner ring road, diesel cars and HGVs become much more dominant in the pollution sources. So, and then the next thing we need to know is, where is that pollution having a serious impact? So these are some dispersion model outputs. So basically contour plots of pollution, in this case nitrogen dioxide. We've got the M11 and the A14 sort of framing Cambridge. The red line in the centre is an area that's designated as an area of poor air quality. And within that, you can see that there are red patches around sort of junctions of the inner ring road, the bus station area, Catholic Church interchange particularly, out towards the station. And then there are some kind of significant portion out towards Addenbrooks and so on. And of course, the main roads. So I'm out of time, but that's the same for particles. Particles are much more sort of dominant on the major routes, major transport routes outside. So if I just squeeze onto my final slide, because my time is up. The areas we're concerned about pollution are around Drummer Street Car Park, Station Square around CB1, Cambridge Biomedical Campus, roundabouts and so on, junctions on the inner ring road. And monitoring shows that in these areas where we're seeing an increase in traffic, we're also seeing increasing concentrations of nitrogen dioxide. So in summary, what you need to know is that transport is the dominant source of pollution in Cambridge that we're concerned with. Of those, inside the inner ring road, it's largely buses and public service vehicles that we're most concerned about. Outside, it's mostly diesel cars. And in some of those areas, we're above the legal limits. So that's what you need to be concerned about when considering these transport issues in the round. Okay, thanks.
Well done. Hello, I'm Liz Robin. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm Director of Public Health for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So my job covers all aspects of health, really, across quite a wide area. I'm not an air quality expert, like some of the others here, but I'm putting air quality in the wider context of health. So Joe talked about 106 deaths in Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire a year from air pollution. Those are the national figures. But just to explain that, it's very unlikely that one death is caused by air pollution. What happens is that air pollution increases perhaps the risk of heart disease or the risk of lung disease, and that goes alongside someone's other risks, like perhaps their diet or their physical activity or their family history of heart disease, and air pollution contributes to that. So we're not talking about 106 individuals that you can sort of separate from everyone else. It's that if you look at all the deaths in Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire, then and that's about 2,000 deaths a year, then 106 of those is the modelled estimate of what's caused by air quality. I think that's quite important. Okay, and putting that again in context, this is a chart of risk factors for causes of death. The biggest ones up at the top are dietary risks and smoking, almost 20% of deaths each. So those are the really big risks. Then you have physical activity, and low physical activity is very important. Physical activity contributes to health, and some people say this study, Global Burden of Disease, estimates a bit low on physical activity. Alcohol and drug use is important. Then there's a whole bunch of medical stuff, which I won't go into. And down at the bottom, you have air pollution, which is your biggest environmental risk factor for the deaths. Okay, about 5% of those. Something else about the two pollutants that Joe was talking about, the nitrogen oxides and the small particles. There's no absolutely safe level of them. You can't just say there's a cut-off and below that it's having a few of these particles or whatever is absolutely safe. Because risk is graded and it's continuous. It's a bit like if you have a glass of wine, then you're very slightly increasing your risk of cancer. So nearly everything we do has a bit of risk, but there's no absolute cut-off of risk for the air quality. So this picture shows the short-term and long-term health effects of air pollution, and we tend to take the pollutants together because actually some of the studies we look at, it's quite hard to tease them apart. In the short term, when you've got very high air pollution on a particular day, it can exacerbate asthma, respiratory symptoms, and people who have heart disease or lung disease are more likely to be admitted to hospital with an exacerbation, and there is raised mortality. The long-term effects are reduced life expectancy. So the long-term exposure to air pollution, stroke, lung cancer, respiratory conditions, heart disease goes up. I won't go into the sources of air pollution because I think other people will do that. But it's cars, it's a whole lot of other things. Complex slide. Air pollution does affect people throughout their lifetime, right from pregnancy. In childhood, we're particularly worried about impact on lung development and respiratory through to adults and elderly. And it affects everyone, but there's inequalities in exposure and vulnerability. So we worry particularly about pregnant women, children, people with existing disease, communities with poorer air quality, if they're very close to big main roads, and older people who tend to be more vulnerable due to their health. And it's not an issue that occurs in isolation. So a lot of measures to improve air quality will also have some overall environmental quality improvement, increased physical activity. If people aren't using cars, that has a big impact on health if everybody gets more active. Noise reduction, potentially greater road safety, and climate change mitigation. So if we address air pollution by providing good quality infrastructure and public transport, and we encourage people to walk and cycle rather than drive, that has a whole bunch of positive health impacts, partly from the air quality, but actually a lot from the walking, cycling, and active travel. Okay, thank you.
So thank you to Joe and Liz for that. So as before, a little bit later we'll be coming back for questions. So please do, as the speakers are speaking, if you have a question, jot it down on the post-its, and there'll be a little bit of time in a bit to discuss those with your table and agree the questions that are going to be asked. So earlier we heard about some of the links between congestion and air pollution and the environment. So the next speaker we're going to hear from is going to particularly focus on those environmental impacts. So very pleased to welcome Dr. Justin Bishop to talk to the environmental impacts.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Over the next few minutes, I want to talk about, in a sense, how we've got to the climate change situation that we're in, the role of transport, and then how government and our individual choices can help, in a sense, bring the climate back from where it is. So the top two pictures in this collage give a good indication of the type of events that we've seen already and that we might see more of in the future. So the top left is part of a report by the head of the Environment Agency that was talking about England becoming more water scarce within the next 25 years because climate change is disrupting the types of rainfall patterns that we've become used to, and that rainfall is important for recharging the reservoirs from which we draw drinking water. At the same time, we have storms on the east coast, which combined with wind, rain, storm surge, and sea level rise are leading to the sea actually reclaiming villages, as you can see this house falling into the water on the Norfolk coast. But these types of issues or events are not peculiar to the UK. We see longer, more severe droughts. We see more powerful storms in the Atlantic and in the Pacific, stronger monsoons, and then sometimes weaker monsoons. The problem is that in isolation, each of these events could be considered a one-off. But the fact that they are more frequent and more intense suggests an underlying change to the climate. What that means for society is that we bear the cost and the consequences of these events. So the storms that came through the southwest in the winter of 2013-14 are forecast to have cost about £1.4 billion. And that's before the disruption to lives and livelihood. All of this has led to almost 1,000 local authorities and cities declaring a climate emergency, of which City of Cambridge and Cambridgeshire County are one of the signatories, and if you look at all of the UK local authorities, that's about 70% of the population in a declared climate emergency area demanding action from the government. But if we're going to talk about mitigating climate change, or in a sense bringing the climate back from where it is, it's important to understand how we've got to this position. So the atmosphere contains heat-trapping gases, and that's what moderates the surface temperature. It acts like a duvet around the planet. Without them, the temperature extremes would not be able to support life in the way that we know it. So having those heat-trapping gases there is important. The problem is that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, our use of fossil fuels has emitted far more heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere than can be, in effect, dealt with. So they're accumulating. What that means, to continue the duvet analogy, is that we're shoving 3, 4, 5, 6 duvets on top of each other. And if you've slept under 5 duvets, you'll appreciate it's quite warm. And that's what we're seeing at the surface. The warming of the surface, the swelling of the oceans, is leading primarily to changes in climate, which is driving some of these extreme and frequent weather events. So for us to then turn that around, to effectively turn around the climate change, it is expected that we need to, the emissions of heat-trapping gases needs to peak next year, 2020, and fall every year after that, going negative by 2019. Now, what that means for every country in the world cannot be overstated, because all of our economies are completely wed to the use of fossil fuels. Right? And what we're saying is that our use of fossil fuels globally must peak next year and fall every year after that. And importantly, the reason why it has to fall so quickly is because we have, from the Industrial Revolution to today, we've been pushing the climate in a particular direction. And what we're trying to do is pull it back in the next 80 years. And you can see that even with our most valiant efforts, you can see how slowly the climate is predicted to respond. Okay? It's like taking one of the markers and pushing it along the table. After you stop pushing it, it still rolls. Okay? So, looking at transport is important. Transport is almost exclusively dependent upon fossil fuels. We see it because about 1/3 of UK emissions are attributed to transport, and almost half the emissions in the county. And when we look at some of the ways that, some of where we see the emissions coming from, we see the use of diesel fuel since the year 2000 up more than 2.5 times. Things like that. Now, vehicles are broadly getting more fuel efficient. We are driving less than we did in the year 2000, but the number of vehicles on the road has grown 30%. As a consequence, therefore, we see this transport beginning with a large role, and that role increasing as other sectors start to decarbonize. Now, we talk about the role potentially of electric vehicles, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, hydrogen, and so on. But fundamentally, these vehicles altogether still account for less than 2% of vehicles in circulation. They're starting off from a very low baseline and taking a long time to see any sort of market uptake. So effectively, in this room, 98% of us are still buying petrol and diesel cars. Okay. The Committee on Climate Change advises the UK government on how to achieve its climate change targets. And the recent guidance suggests that we should be aiming for net zero emissions by 2050. So what that means is that for every unit of heat-trapping gas that we emit, we need to find some way, somewhere, to take that back out. That's consistent with that orange modeled prediction I showed before, and with the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, that requires two approaches. One is the individual choices we make. Do we have a trip that we want to take? Do we take it, firstly? Because if we don't take it, there are no emissions. Having decided to take it, can we walk or cycle? Liz was talking about active transport. If walking and cycling, because of distance or time, is not feasible, can we use public transport? And if, after that, we still have to rely on the private car, then it must be electric, because it's zero emissions at the tailpipe. But that's all the bottom up. That's all the individual decisions that we make. It also, this Committee for Climate Change, identifies what the government needs to do. The government has to ensure that the infrastructure is in place to deliver this electrified transport network. Both policies to help us make the right decision and make sure that we actually have the mode choice at the end of the day. So, to conclude, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've committed the climate to the change that we see now. And we're also committing ourselves in some way to undoing all of that change in the next 80 years, which means a large-scale and non-trivial change to the way that everything works in every country, if we're going to get this net zero emissions by 2050. And as I said, it's not just a combination of top-down, but it really reflects the individual decisions that we make in how we go about satisfying our mobility needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Justin. So before we hear the next speakers, there's going to be a bit of time on your table now just to reflect and think about kind of what are the key questions that you want to put to the speakers who have already gone. So I'm going to hand over to your table facilitators to lead that. And we're looking for one priority question for each of the two presentations. So we're dealing with Joe and Liz as kind of one around kind of health impacts, and then one around environmental impacts as well. So over to table facilitators. The health impacts, we've heard about the environmental impacts. The next impacts we're going to hear about, so the impacts on work and business. So we have Dan Thorp from Cambridgeshire Head, who's going to come to talk to us about those. Thank you. Over to you.
Hi. Thanks very much. So I'm Dan from Cambridgeshire Head, and we are a member organisation made up of just over 40 businesses and academic institutions in Cambridge, representing over 40,000 employees, so tend to be bigger organisations. Sorry, is that better? Cool. So we are a member organisation made up of businesses and academic organisations representing over 40,000 employees, tend to be the bigger institutions in Cambridge that are invested in the long-term success of the area. And what we try and do is showcase and bring evidence on what's really happening in the Cambridge economy and work with government at all tiers of national and local levels to help influence decisions about how Cambridge can grow. And transport is a key issue for us within that. So in terms of what's going on in the Cambridge economy, the evidence kind of, I guess, reinforces what people will be experiencing, but it's important to be clear about it. So the chart on the left here shows the transition really that happened in the late 80s, early 90s, when Cambridge went from being a university town to a booming economy, and more people started commuting outside of Cambridge into work in Cambridge than were working from within the city. And that gap has grown ever since as the economy has taken off. The chart on the right reinforces that. So that shows the travel to work area, so the commuter catchment for Cambridge, and how that changed over the 10-year period between 2001 and 2011. So the Cambridge economy has been growing quickly, and clearly that has implications for travel and transport into and around the city. So this just demonstrates, in relation to other places in the east of England, quite how severe the travel congestion issues can get in Cambridge, and how journey times are reduced during peak hours in Cambridgeshire, more so than anywhere else in the east of England. So the growth of the Cambridge economy is having real impacts on how people can interact and work in and around Cambridge. Those are statistics that are recognised and everyone agrees with. But one of the key issues that we have, that we at Cambridgeshire try to work quite closely on, is a disparity or difference between what is nationally captured in terms of the Cambridge economy, how quickly that is growing and the scale of the economy, and what's really happening on the ground. So we commission research each year with the University of Cambridge to look at the employment growth, so the numbers of new jobs that are being created in and around the Cambridge economy each year, and compare those with the statistics that are captured nationally. And what we've shown from that is that there's actually quite a big difference. So the figures on the left-hand side are what's captured nationally about the percentage increase in employment in Cambridge each year, or over a 6-year period. And on the right-hand side, what we can show by taking a more granular look and working more closely with Cambridge businesses about what's really happening on the ground. And there's quite a significant difference or gap between the two. And the effect of that is really to amplify those problems and issues with congestion and travel. So the investment and decisions that are taken in Cambridge are based on statistics for the growth of the area, and those statistics currently don't quite capture what's really going on. So what we try and do is bring a greater insight to the true scale of growth in the Cambridge economy. We worked with government partners last year to pull all of that into a report, and essentially what that adds up to is a situation which is untenable and really needs some big issues and big decisions to be taken to address that challenge. So given the level of growth of the Cambridge economy and the impact that has on travel time and on house prices and a number of other factors, what that granular look at the economy on the ground shows us is that if we look to the future, if we don't act decisively and at a transformational major level, then the Cambridge economy will go into decline, and that's quite simply because the cost of doing business in Cambridge will become too much, so businesses will move away. It will cost too much to live here, it will take too long for people to come and work, so the Cambridge economy is in danger of falling over the edge and actually going into decline because of how all of those issues add up together. And what we're trying to do at the minute is really highlight the level of that challenge that we're facing. So businesses and the businesses that are represented through our organisation, I think, understand that it is their responsibility to also act as part of this and to find solutions to those challenges. So, for example, Frontier, who are a computer games development company on the Science Park, have worked and invested quite a lot to improve cycling facilities and sharing facilities in their organisation, which has enabled them to reduce single occupancy car usage to work by quite a drastic amount. So that's now down to 31%, which is quite significantly lower than other businesses on the Science Park. The Per School this term have started investing in bus services so that they can actually take children to school and reduce the amount of parents that are bringing children into school at peak times and adding to congestion issues. So I think it's fair to say that a number of Cambridge businesses and the bigger institutions see it as part of their responsibility to find solutions and ways to improve the situation. But the point I'd like to finish on is just to reinforce that I think the scale of the challenge is such that those solutions will not be able to overcome things in their own right. We really need to look at quite large scale and transformational ways to overcome the travel issues that Cambridge faces, because looking to the future, they do present serious difficulties for the growth and even the continued prosperity of the Cambridge economy as it is now.
Thank you to Dan. So next up, we were due to hear from Helena Tiveridge, who unfortunately can't join us today because she came down with a migraine. So, but fortunately, David Metz, one of our expert leads, has agreed to stand in for her. So we're going to hear from David, who will talk about some of the personal impacts and the impacts on kind of people's daily lives that the issues we're talking about can have.
Well, thank you for an opportunity to talk to you rather earlier than I'd anticipated. Clearly, mobility is very important for our lives, and if we lack mobility for any reason, our quality of life is likely to be lower. Now, some people have difficulty in getting around, and we need to think about their problems because over time they may also be our problems. And in thinking about the future of transport, we need to include as many people as we can in the provision we plan to make. Now, there are two broad areas, I think, that we need to think about. Firstly, the problems of rural areas for people who don't have access to a car. Maybe they're too young to drive or too old past the age of driving, or maybe their incomes are too low to afford a car. And here the quality and quantity of bus services is really important. And we need to bear that in mind in our future thinking. The second category are people with disabilities. Some people have disabilities earlier in life, but many of us, as we get older, will have a variety of disabilities arising from getting on in years. Now, in this context, an important approach is called inclusive design, because if you design for the young, you tend to exclude the old, whereas if you design for the old, you're very likely to include the young. And the kind of examples in the transport area are low-floor buses that help people with wheelchairs get aboard, but also people with prams, children in prams, and you get faster boarding, which means less time at bus stops and shorter journeys. Another example is dispensing with cash payments on buses, where that's possible, using smart cards or cashless payment cards of various kind, saving people fussing with cash and speeding up boarding. More generally, we need technologies that forgive us our inadequacies. And I think the classic example, not in the area of transport, is the word processor. Because if those of you old enough to remember manual typewriters, they were really very demanding of your skills, and you can make an awful lot of mess with snowflake to correct your errors, whereas the modern word processor forgives us our inadequacies. So we need to think about forgiving technologies in the transport sector. Another example with modern computers is the ability to increase the font size when your sight is less acute than it was. These digital technologies are relatively cheap to develop and cheap to deploy. And so thinking about what digital innovation can do to assist us with disability, particularly in later life, I think should be a priority. So in summary, just kick off a discussion, it seems to me that two key things to improve the inclusivity of the transport system are, one, a focus on buses generally, but particularly in rural areas, and second, to take advantage of digital technologies where innovation may be of great help.
Thank you very much to David. So we've heard from Justin on the impacts on the economy and business, and from David on the impact on people's lives, and particularly people with disabilities. So now, same again, you're going to have 10 minutes with your table to agree the priority questions that you want to put to them in the next Q&A session. So over to your table facilitators now. Some answers. So we're going to call our speakers up to do their best Westlife impressions on these lovely bar stools. Just wait for the key change where they stand up and go for it. So similar to before, and we don't have a huge amount of time, so we're going to try and rattle through as many questions as possible. We're going to come table by table and ask you to address your question to a specific speaker. So let's actually start with table 1 to begin with. And can we have a question for Joe and Liz?
Yes, our sort of main question was, how does our air quality compare to other similar sized counties, and what are they doing to overcome similar issues?
Okay, so can you hear, is this working now? Yeah. Okay, so Cambridge itself, and that's what I've got most information about, is quite... Sorry. Cambridge is quite a small city in terms of population, but as you've heard, it draws in a lot of employment journeys. And it's also not really designed for the car. So air pollution in Cambridge is worse than other cities of its population size, quite considerably. And it faces a number of challenges on that point, but it is significantly better than large cities in the UK. So actually we're very, very close to legal compliance with our air quality objectives as they currently stand, but as Liz says, there's no safe level of air pollution. Whereas somewhere like London or Birmingham, they can be a good 20 or 30% above those legal limits. We're very, very close to them. But we are challenged by our growth. So that has to be borne in mind.
Great. Just a reminder to all the speakers, please, to keep the microphone nice and close to your mouth and speak nice and loudly. I'm going to come to table 2 now for a question for Justin.
Oh, for Justin, that's the next page. There he is. Justin, we agree it's important.
Okay, so perhaps if we do a question for Dan instead, and then we'll find a question for Justin from somebody else.
So we're going to Dan. Oh, Dan. So how can we persuade more businesses to subsidise aspects of the transport system, particularly buses, not least because big businesses should be more responsible about looking for solutions?
So some businesses do already. Some businesses in Cambridge do actively invest in or subsidise transport or make other investments that are trying to find solutions to the issue. So I agree that is part of what we should be doing, and part of the sort of thing an organisation like Cambridge Ahead can do is showcase that and sort of leading by example thing. But I would say the sort of point I've finished on that will only go so far, and the scale of the issue is probably a bit bigger than that overall, I think.
Okay, so we shortchanged Justin last time, so I'm going to come to table 3 for a question for Justin.
So we all agreed that climate change required bold action, and we just wondered why it hasn't happened yet that government can just legislate and say all public transport has to be electric.
Well, there are a range of reasons. Partly, I think, is what's been on offer, the technology availability. In fact, as you ask about public transport specifically, some of the work around the clean air programs that are taking place around the country, so the London ULEZ, the clean air program in Manchester and other places, there's a large interest in electrifying buses, but actually there are not that many companies that make them. And when but almost all the local authorities go after them, there's a serious issue of supply. So on some of the electrification of public transport, there's a supply challenge. Freight is the same thing. So I'll give you an example, sort of a Ford Transit style Ducato van. Fiat only has 12 allocated to the entire UK for this production year. So if you want an electric Ducato, you're on the waiting list. And that's the kind, so there's strong supply issues there. But I think also there's been a hope that, because other European countries, Norway, Germany, and others, have had they've pushed a lot stronger from the top down for electrifying road freight and public transport, more so than the UK has. And so as a commercial car and van manufacturer, I'm making the products where I know it can get them sold. And anything that's left over comes over here, basically, at this stage. I think the reason why we're late to the electrification game for some things is because we had hoped that diesels would be clean, right? We have the Euro standards in place with the hope that they're going to get cleaner. But of course, Dieselgate's thrown that all into the air. So there's a little bit of that going on.
Okay, so I'm going to come to table 4 next, Isabel, if you don't mind, and ask for a question for David, please.
Oh, David. Our question was actually about, it talked about digital tech. We'd like to understand a little bit more about how it can improve commuting in a public transport way. I didn't quite really get it.
Well, I think there is quite good routing apps for some cities at least. City Mapper is a nice example, which shows you how to get from home to work or wherever you want to go to by whatever transport mode you want, public transport, walking, cycling, how many calories you'll use by way of exercise, how long it will take you. This is an example of digital technology developed by the private sector, available free of charge if you've got a smartphone, generating choices. Public authorities like Transport for London have a very good journey planner which allows you to do the same thing. So these technologies are fundamentally quite cheap because they can be rolled out to huge populations of people. And I think in comparison with spending money on infrastructure or vehicles, which is very expensive, we should take full advantage of the digital technologies, both to generate more options and to cope with our regular journeys to work.
Thank you very much. So we're going to come to table 5 now for a question for Joe or Liz.
Hi. So what are the realistic and affordable alternatives to cars? And in brackets, I think we probably had sort of rural situations in mind here. You know, people travelling from a sort of a remote rural location to say come into Cambridge. What are the realistic and affordable alternatives to a car in that situation?
I think that's probably a little bit beyond my remit, but I live in a rural area. I've got teenage children who need to be mobile. Sorry. For me, the immediate solution would be an electric car, and they should be affordable soon. I mean, I'd like to add to the answer that you gave is that the car companies, manufacturers in this country have still got an awful lot of diesel engine production to sell, and that is also having an impact on supply. They're not keen to sell. We've brought in fairly progressive policies around electric taxis, for instance, and there's a very big supply issue trying to mobilise that policy incentive as well. So I think the medium-term solution is for people in rural areas to move to electrified transport. I think that also you shouldn't ignore electric bikes and electric cargo bikes, which can really expand the sort of range you can cover with cycling, but also have a phenomenally lower impact than even an electric car. So you can get about 50 times the miles per kilowatt on an electric bike than you can in an electric car. So, you know, that's really significant in both climate and air quality terms.
Okay, coming to table 6 for a question for Justin.
Okay, so for Justin, sorry. Okay, where is the electricity for electric transport going to come from? And a slash on that, how do you control it?
So as part of the electric vehicle discussion, there's often the will we have enough electricity? They go hand in hand, but actually, for sure we will. And in fact, with population growth and each of us using more electricity for stationary things, lights, electronics and all that kind of thing, electricity demand is growing quite separately from what's required for road transport. So we know that capacity will be put in. I think the issue with electric vehicles is more the local network. So for instance, if you're trying to plug in outside a building, does that building have basically a pipe big enough to supply the power to itself and a whole host of electric cars parked outside? So that's quite local issues rather than the entire network. So I think we can rest assured that we will have enough power at a national level. It's really at the local level in network congestion. The controlling aspect, what do you mean by how do you control it?
Does anyone want to extend on? Okay, so I think it was more around resources. So so if it was kind of a wind turbine or something like that, how could that be monitored or controlled?
So you're thinking more in the terms of resource use and making sure that we're not sort of switching wholesale from sort of abusing fossil fuels to abusing other resources? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So interestingly, the issue of decarbonizing electricity in many ways allows us to continue using large amounts of energy, in some senses guilt-free, right? The whole notion of future generations is so that we leave some oil in the ground for them. But at the same time, if we're using all the other resources, that can't be fair either. So issues or the objective to reduce demand first, so do you walk, or rather, do you take the trip, and if you must, then you walk or cycle, and you go down the hierarchy like that, allows you broadly, or hopefully, to still satisfy the larger of your mobility needs while still reducing the demand, so actually you don't need as much energy, and so that in some ways, some of these questions, you don't hit the limits of other resources, such as things that will go into the same turbines or the photovoltaics and that sort of thing.
Okay, table 7 for a question for Dan.
How can employers enable people to afford to have a home in Cambridge?
Sorry, how can employers enable people to afford, employees to afford?
Sorry, yeah, enable their employees to afford to have a home in Cambridge.
So it's, well, thanks for that. I mean, Cambridge is clearly one of the most difficult places to do something. And the affordability for houses is something like 15 times average salaries at the minute, which is, it's a severe problem in Cambridge because of the success and rapid growth of the Cambridge economy, and the fact that that hasn't been responded to sufficiently in investments that have been made. I think the solutions to that business can play a role in are trying to work alongside the government at a local level to try and find ways in which the right sort of housing provision can be put in place. So key worker type housing and housing for employees that are really central to the Cambridge economy, to make sure that policy provision reflects that on one side, and then on trying to improve supply. So Cambridge does sit at a point in time where there's some major strategic sites due to come forward, so there's an opportunity to do things that get it right coming up for the city, I think. And so there's a role for business to be quite proactive in working alongside other developers and local government in making the best of the opportunities Cambridge has still got for sites to be developed, I think.
Okay, and to table 8 for a question for David, please.
Oh, I thought you were going somewhere else. Okay, I've put that down. Okay, so this question is a sort of framing and conceptualization type of question. So thinking about making transport more inclusive, if it's the case that air pollution disproportionately impacts on people who are already vulnerable, then surely to make public transport more inclusive, you wouldn't go down a polluting vehicle route. That's my slightly free interpretation of the question that's up on the flip chart.
Yes, I think the answer to both urban air quality and carbon emissions is to electrify both cars, vans, buses and goods vehicles, because then they become clean, and you in that way have solved the problem of urban air pollution. So the question is, how do we expedite that process? Now, much of it's at national level with government incentives for vehicle purchase, but local authorities can help the process, partly by investing in public electricity charging points for vehicles, partly by working with the public transport companies, the bus companies, to work out how they can adopt electric vehicle fleets. As we've heard, there are, in the short run, supply difficulties, I think, ultimately due to the problem of scaling up battery capacity. But I think quite big investments are being made there. So we can assume that over a not too great a period of time, there will be sufficient supply of the vehicles we need. And so the question is, what can local government do to expedite the process of electric vehicle uptake to improve urban air quality and reduce carbon emissions?
Okay, this is where we start to test my memory of which tables have asked which speaker a question. So I'm going to come actually to table 2 to begin with and ask for a question for either Joe or Liz. So Steve, is a question for Joe or Liz?
I'm sorry, I've been having questions as we speak. Oh, well, a lot of our Joe or Liz questions were actually answered but in part by other people's queries. But Dave, it's a real risk turning over these pages. No, he was he's mostly answered as well. No, there was something, I think, should we come back to this issue of a ban? Because it was mentioned over here more generically, and in relation to the City Council itself, the role of diesel buses, why don't you just ban them?
Okay,
as there are alternatives.
Looking to the room, if it was down to me, I simply would. And where district authority, which Cambridge City Council is, we have some jurisdiction over taxis, and that's what we've done effectively. We've set out a pathway to zero emission taxis. The bus situation under current deregulated activity is much more difficult, but what we could do is work together to have a ban on certain categories of vehicles in certain areas. And that's known as a clean air zone or an ultra low emission zone, as it's been called in other places. And I think that that's a way in which you can develop a policy which drives change within the transport sector. And so, you know, without any direct levers, there are other direct levers, because you can take on something called bus franchising, where you take on control of the whole public transport service and franchise out each route to certain operators, and you can create conditions around that. So there are a number of ways of doing it, but none of them are trivial. So they're quite significant. So either create a zone where only certain vehicles can travel, or work franchising out the routes and put conditions around the vehicles that are allowed to use them in that way. Indeed.
Okay, I'm going to come back to table 1 for a question for Justin, please.
I will just find our... so this is kind of linking to some other questions, but it was, you say, and there's been a lot of talk about increase in using electric cars, but is the manufacturing process to create those electric cars and then the destruction of petrol and diesel cars not cancelling out the benefits?
There are studies that are looking particularly at the environmental burdens of batteries, both the manufacturing and the disposal, for sure. I suppose it really depends on what type of environmental impact you're trying to quantify, right? If it's greenhouse gas emissions, that's one thing. If it is toxicity, the dealing with heavy metals, the large-scale mining activities that are required for some of the battery elements, that's a different type of environmental impact. In some ways, and I think this is partly to do with the management of demand, is that we're already, in a sense, dealing with the best battery technology, more or less, that we have in terms of lithium. We're not going to get a better electropositive element than that. What we pair the lithium with remains to be seen, and that will change over time. But ultimately, lithium is going to always be a component. And the question then becomes, how much lithium do we have, given that we know it's going to be fixed? And what does that price look like as we increase the demand for it? We have lithium in our phones, we have it in our computers, we have it in all sorts of things. And now we want to completely electrify the transport system with that same lithium, broadly speaking. Some have described creating a market for recycling of batteries and so on, either through secondary use or recovering the lithium and redeploying it. It remains to be seen. But yes, there are going to be environmental impacts, which I think up to now haven't received too much attention because the proportion of electric or non-conventional vehicles has been small. But you can imagine that if we switch from the 2% of, or rather, let's say last year, there were 6% of new vehicles in the UK had a battery of some sort in it. And we're talking about by 2040, the ban of all conventional petrol and diesel sales. So that means that 2 million vehicles coming on the road in 2041 will have a battery in it, basically. That's how many vehicles we add to the road every year, 2 million. So at that point, we can start, you'll start seeing, I would have thought, the discussion of environmental impacts, I'm sure, will change. And we'll transition from greenhouse gases to these broader environmental impacts.
Okay, so I'm going to come to table 4 next for a question for Dan, please.
Okay, so it starts with a statement, which is, surely indefinite growth is not sustainable on many levels. So can we opt for a sustainable economy that avoids indefinite growth, but also avoids decline? Utopia, I know.
So yes, I think I agree with the statement, and the answer in that is how Cambridge as an economy grows over the wider region, how what happens in the city at the minute is spread across in a sustainable and well-planned way and connected way across the wider area into Cambridgeshire and surrounding market towns, and planning that in a way that can take the best of what happens in Cambridge, and lots of businesses want to be in Cambridge because of what it is, but planning how that can be spread in a thoughtful and careful and sustainable way is the answer we need to try and get to.
Great. Okay. So, well, question for it's going to have to be David. So.
Okay.
The next round will be Liz.
Okay. David, has anyone done any sort of study into the number of children who walk to school 30 years ago compared to walking to school now, and if that's declined, and the distance they have to travel to school?
I'm not aware of such studies. I'm sure they've been done, but of course one's observation is that the school run by car has become very common, such that certainly in my neighbourhood during holiday times, you know, the roads in the morning before school opening hours are quite empty. And this is happening partly for parental anxieties about safety of children. I think that also contributes to the growth of large SUV type vehicles. But also people exercising more choice of schools. If you expect your children to walk to school, then the choices of school they can get to are limited. If you have ambition to send your children to a better school or a different school further away, then if there's not convenient public transport, at least for secondary schools, then people turn to the car. So this is one of the issues, that if you want to push back on the car, particularly the school run, where you think, you know, that's not absolutely essential, you have to face the fact that you may be depriving people of choice of educational facilities for their children. Don't know what the answer is to that, but we will need to think about that.
Okay, I'm going to come to table 6 next for a question for Liz, if that's okay.
If we're encouraging more cycling and walking, are we also increasing the intake of pollution through exercise?
That has been studied in quite a bit of depth by the a local research institution called CEDA, and they've modelled the health impact of cycling and walking in different levels of pollution. And it is actually quite reassuring for those of us in this country, because you find that in normal UK cities, you benefit more from the exercise than the disbenefit from the pollution. Where it starts to get more tricky is in some of the Chinese or Indian cities where the levels of pollution are much higher, and then you might still get some benefit from, say, your first 20 minutes of brisk exercise, because the benefit of the exercise goes down a bit after you've had the first 20 minutes, half hour. And as you carry on exercising for longer, the impact on you of the high pollution level goes up. So if you're in Delhi or some of the industrial Chinese cities, absolutely. But in the UK, you are generally doing better out of the exercise, with the impact of the pollution being much smaller.
Great, thank you. So table 5 next for a question for Justin.
Oh, I don't think we have any other questions for Justin. Oh yes, beg your pardon, thank you. Yeah, my table's just pointed out one to me which I hadn't spotted. So what role could biofuel play in the alternative fuel scenario for transport?
So biofuels plays a role, and in a technical sense, and that's partly because under the European regulations, CO2 has been what we've gone after in reducing CO2, and they've classified biofuels as zero emissions, right? And so if you say, well, actually it's zero emissions, then there's going to be a move to introducing higher biofuels. Of course, we know that's not the case, right? It's not dissimilar to the electric vehicles. Where do you get the electricity from, right? Where do you get the biofuels from? And if you're leveling whole heaps of primary rainforest to plant oil palms, then that can't be seen as a better outcome. There are some technical issues with biofuels mixing in with current combustion engines. So generally, you might have a blend, maybe 10%, because bioethanol is a bit acidic, and so it causes issues in the pipework. But yes, there is a role, but we have to appreciate, I think, or we have to be mindful of not problem shifting, right? The process of extracting and refining crude oil and delivering refined oils to a filling station is very efficient, notwithstanding the combustion component. It's very efficient. When we start shifting to agriculture, there are all sorts of induced land use changes that come along with that. Food for fuel and all those sorts of debates come into play. And there are not that many, I would say, biorefineries that will shift from the processes they're doing now to a biofuel if they're not assured that it's going to be bought at scale. Because these, again, in the same way as the car manufacturers from the table down there, these are all commercial businesses, right? And they're going to make a product they can sell. Some of it's going to be driven by regulation. You must combine biofuels, and then, of course, there's an assured market. But we have to make sure that we're not shifting and bringing in a whole heap of feedstock that's actually going to create worse problems, even if it's out of sight.
It's also just worth adding that biofuels are similar, if not worse, to diesel in terms of internal combustion engine polluting emissions. So they have more nitrogen in, they produce more nitrogen dioxide per gallon than diesel.
Okay, so we've got time for another couple of questions before the break. So I'm going to come to table 8 next for your question for Dan, please.
Well, okay, so our questions for Dan have been answered, except for, okay, this was a slight different one. What can businesses do to influence the choices that their employees make about getting to or about work transport?
So I think that's an area where business can and should, and indeed in quite a few businesses is doing quite a lot at the minute. And that can range from that could be quite a wide variety of things. So some of the businesses that we work with have, for example, really improved cycling facilities and invited cycle repair mechanics alongside that. Things like that really have a direct impact on the choices people make, through to promoting and actually investing in travel options. So I think there's a lot that businesses can do. And the more that is brought out, the more other businesses can follow that lead and can actually have a tangible impact on the situation in the city. Like I said before, the scale of the problem is probably much bigger than that, but that's definitely a useful contribution I think that business can make.
Okay, and finally to table 7 for your question for David, please.
So in relation to being inclusive, how do we persuade profit-driven bus companies to provide services to uneconomic routes?
Yes, that's a really good question. The Conservative government in the 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher decided there would be big benefits from making buses competitive. So they privatised and deregulated bus services outside London. London they left as an integrated service under Transport for London. That's been very, very successful. Outside London, the benefits of competition rather failed to emerge because the bus companies didn't want to compete because that would drive down their profits, and so they kind of carved up the territories. So they operate under a commercial regime, and if there's subsidy available from local authorities to fund bus routes that would be uneconomic, they're willing to take the money, and of course they take the money to cover the free fares for older people. But the ability of local authorities to fund such buses is very limited because of the general pressures on local authorities. So the question is, should one give up this competitive bus arrangement? And the disadvantages of the regime have been recognised even by Conservative governments, so that there is legislation in place which would allow a reversion to a publicly managed system. And the city that's pursuing this, first and foremost, is Manchester. And if they are successful in taking back into the public domain the bus system, then that may provide a model for other cities to follow. But there are potentially quite big financial risks in taking on a whole bus service. But if it's possible to move to the kind of system we have in London, where the responsibility for the whole network is under Transport for London, under the mayor, but actually the individual buses are operated by private sector companies under contract, that works fine, because you can use the income both from profitable routes and also from parking charges, from congestion charges, to subsidise routes which might not be profitable. That has proved to be a good system. So the question in the long run for an area like Greater Cambridge is whether there will be scope for bringing the bus service back into the London-type model. And my suggestion is you wait and see what happens in Manchester, and if they think it's doable, think about it at that point.
Fantastic. Well, that was better value than any Westlife performance. I'm sure you'll agree. So can we say a huge thank you to our speakers? So now it's time for a quick break. So 15 minutes. So back in here at 3:30, please.